far beyond the familiar coastlines of the Mediterranean, past the narrow gateway where the sea opens toward the Atlantic, Plato places an island so large, so wealthy, and so powerful that it seems to belong less to geography than to a dream remembered after waking. Ships move through engineered harbours, temples rise behind rings of water and land, metals gleam in walls and towers, a royal house claims descent from a god of the sea, across a fertile plain, canals divide the earth with almost mathematical order, yet the entire world is already doomed. Before the account can settle into certainty, the island is swallowed by earthquake and flood, and the sea itself becomes difficult to cross, choked, Plato says, by the mud left behind. The civilization vanishes with astonishing speed, leaving behind no monument that can be pointed to, no inscription that names its kings, no harbour whose stones can be measured without dispute. What remains is a story. And almost everything about that story becomes stranger the more closely it is examined. The gateway Plato names is the Pillars of Heracles, usually associated with the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean narrows before opening into the Atlantic. For Greek audiences, this was not merely a point on a map. It marked the edge of a mental world, a threshold between travelled waters and the enormous uncertainty beyond. To place a vanished island, there was to place it just outside ordinary knowledge, close enough to imagine, distant enough to escape easy verification. The Atlantic beyond the Pillars could hold almost anything islands, monsters, strange peoples, perhaps even the ruins of a power older than every known kingdom. Plato describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia together, though those ancient geographical terms did not refer to the full modern continents. Even so, the scale is deliberately immense. This is not presented as a forgotten fishing settlement or a minor island court. It is a maritime power whose influence reaches across seas and whose ambition threatens the societies within the Mediterranean world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, Atlantis rewards patience because it does not offer a single puzzle. There is the geographical puzzle of where such an island could have existed. There is the chronological puzzle of a war placed thousands of years before Plato's own lifetime. There is the archaeological puzzle of why no evidence has appeared for an empire of such size. There is the literary puzzle of why the story appears inside philosophical dialogues concerned with ideal societies, political order, human decline, and the forces that destroy states from within. And there is the psychological puzzle of why generations continue to search for a place that may never have existed outside Plato's imagination. The first surprise is that the ancient evidence is far thinner than popular culture often suggests. There is no large archive of independent Greek traditions describing Atlantis. No Egyptian text has yet been identified as Plato's source. No surviving Bronze Age inscription announces a Western island empire matching his account. The story comes to us above all through two works, Timaeus and Critias, written in the 4th century BCE. In them, Atlantis is not introduced as a traveller's report or a merchant's coastal guide. It enters a philosophical conversation. The speakers are discussing the nature of the universe, the design of an ordered society, and the relationship between virtue and power. Atlantis becomes part of that larger structure. It is both a place in the story and a force placed under moral examination. This does not prove that Plato invented every detail. Ancient authors often reshaped inherited traditions, real disasters, distant geography, and political memory into narratives serving larger purposes. The Mediterranean world knew earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, collapsing coastlines, sudden floods, and cities destroyed in a single generation. Sailors returned with reports of islands beyond familiar routes. Communities preserved memories of ruined settlements and shifting shores. Stories moved across languages and centuries, changing as they travelled. A philosopher could draw from many such fragments without leaving a trail modern scholars can reconstruct. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and no single known catastrophe fits all of Plato's description. The account seems at once specific and elusive, detailed enough to invite maps, vague enough to survive every failed identification. The power of the story also comes from the way Atlantis is framed as a civilization at its height. It possesses abundance rather than desperation. Its soil is fertile. Its rulers command resources from across a wide domain. Its people inherit an ordered landscape. The island is not destroyed because it is weak, primitive, or forgotten. It is destroyed after becoming rich, expansive, and morally compromised. That pattern has made Atlantis endlessly reusable. To some readers it is a warning about imperial ambition. To others it is a memory of natural disaster. To still others it is evidence of an advanced prehistoric world erased before conventional history began. Each interpretation selects a different Atlantis from the same text. The modern imagination usually begins with the sinking, but Plato's story is equally concerned with war. Atlantis is said to have ruled islands and territories beyond the Pillars and to have extended its power into the Mediterranean. Its rulers attempt to subdue lands on both sides of the sea. Against them stands an ancient Athens, idealized and almost impossibly remote, whose citizens resist the invading empire. This confrontation matters because it changes the meaning of the catastrophe. Atlantis is not merely an innocent city surprised by geology. It is an aggressive power, defeated morally before it is destroyed physically. The earth and sea then erase both the battlefield and much of the evidence, as though the landscape itself closes over the lesson. That moral structure is one reason many classicists treat the account with caution. Plato did not write as a modern historian, and his dialogues are not neutral records. They're carefully constructed works in which setting, character, myth, and argument support philosophical goals. At the same time, dismissing Atlantis as a simple fable can also feel unsatisfying. The world Plato inhabited was full of ruins whose builders were imperfectly remembered. The Bronze Age palaces of Greece had collapsed centuries earlier. Mycenaean writing had been forgotten. Old walls stood without reliable explanations. Egypt seemed unimaginably ancient. Coastal communities knew that the boundary between land and sea was not permanent. In such a world, the idea of a lost civilization did not need to be purely fantastical. History itself had already demonstrated that complex societies could disappear, leaving later people to misunderstand what remained. This tension keeps Atlantis alive. If it were only a geographical claim, failed searches might have exhausted interest. If it were only a moral allegory, it might have remained mostly within the study of Greek philosophy. Instead, it occupies an unstable border between literature and possible memory. Its details encourage reconstruction, but its context resists literalism. Its destruction resembles real catastrophes, but its scale exceeds the evidence. Its setting points west. Yet nearly every region touched by ancient seafaring has at some time been proposed as its home. Beyond the Pillars, the water still opens into darkness in the mind, even though modern maps now chart every coastline. Somewhere beneath that darkness lies the central problem. The search for Atlantis is not simply a search for an island. It is a search for the moment when story becomes history, when memory becomes myth, and when a real disaster, perhaps, becomes something larger than itself. To approach that boundary, the island must first be rebuilt exactly where it survives most clearly, not beneath the Atlantic, but inside Plato's unfinished world. Plato's unfinished world begins with a chain of voices. The tale is not presented directly by an eyewitness, nor even by someone who claims to have visited the island. It passes through generations, from Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, then through a family line until it reaches Critias, one of the speakers in Plato's dialogue. This layered transmission gives the account an air of inherited authority, but it also places distance between the event and the telling. Every stage introduces the possibility of selection, embellishment, misunderstanding, or invention. Plato is careful enough to make the story sound ancient, yet indirect enough that it cannot easily be tested. The first task, then, is not to ask where Atlantis stood, but to ask what Plato actually says before later centuries begin adding their own islands, technologies, crystals, machines, and lost wisdom. In Timaeus, Atlantis first appears as part of a larger conversation about the ideal state. Socrates has described the kind of society he considers just and well-ordered. He now wants to see such a society in motion, tested by conflict rather than left as an abstract design. Critias responds with a story about an ancient Athens that once faced a great power from beyond the pillars of Heracles. Atlantis enters the dialogue because it provides the enemy required for that political test. The old Athenians are presented as disciplined, virtuous, and organized according to principles resembling the ideal state already under discussion. Atlantis, by contrast, possesses enormous wealth and military power, but its ambition expands beyond proper limits. The conflict is therefore not simply between two armies. It is between restraint and excess, civic virtue and imperial appetite. This context is easy to lose because popular retellings often extract Atlantis from the dialogue and treat it as an independent travel account. Yet in Plato's design, the story supports a philosophical demonstration. Ancient Athens becomes the model society under pressure. Atlantis becomes the powerful aggressor whose strength is not matched by moral order. Even before Critias supplies the elaborate geography, the narrative has a purpose beyond description. That does not automatically make every detail fictional, but it means none of the details should be read as though Plato were compiling a neutral report for future archaeologists. The account then becomes much more elaborate in Critias. Here Plato begins to construct the island's divine origins, its royal genealogy, its landscape, its capital, its economy, and the gradual corruption of its rulers. The sea god Poseidon receives Atlantis when the gods divide the world among themselves. On the island he joins with a mortal woman named Cleito, who lives on a hill surrounded by fertile land. Poseidon protects her by shaping alternating rings of land and water around the central height. Their 10 sons become the first rulers, and the eldest, Atlas, gives his name to the island and the surrounding sea. Plato's Atlantis is therefore not merely old. It belongs to a mythic age in which gods still allocate territory and found dynasties. Its political system is presented as an inherited sacred order. The 10 kings govern separate regions but remain bound by common laws. At intervals they gather in the sanctuary of Poseidon, where they perform rituals, make judgments, and renew their obligations. One of the stranger details is the sacrifice of a bull captured without iron weapons inside the sacred enclosure. The kings then mix its blood with wine and swear to uphold the laws attributed to Poseidon. Such scenes place Atlantis within Greek religious imagination, even though the island itself lies beyond the familiar Greek world. The capital is arranged around the original hill in concentric circles. Canals connect the outer rings to the sea, turning the city into a controlled maritime system. Bridges cross the water, harbours, docks, and naval installations fill the channels. Walls are described as being faced with metals, producing bands of different colours. The innermost wall is associated with orichalcum, a substance Plato treats as a valuable metal, known by name in his own time but then second only to gold. Later writers transform orichalcum into everything from an unknown alloy to a source of supernatural energy. But Plato gives no such description. In his text it is precious, visually striking, and culturally important. It is not a magical fuel. The same distinction matters throughout the account. Plato says Atlantis has ships, canals, temples, baths, farms, armies, chariots, metalworking, and an abundance of natural resources. He does not describe aircraft, electrical power, lasers, anti-gravity devices, or machines capable of controlling the planet. These additions belong to modern occultism, science fiction, and speculative literature. They have become so closely attached to Atlantis that many people assume they are ancient features of the story. They are not. Plato's civilization is extraordinary in scale and organization, but its material world remains recognizably ancient. The island contains forests, cultivated land, mineral resources, animals both wild and domestic, and even elephants. This last detail has inspired endless geographical speculation. Yet Plato may simply be using the animal to emphasize the richness and breadth of the island's environment. The central plain is enormous, regular in shape, and surrounded by mountains. It is crossed by canals that support transport and irrigation. The description combines agricultural abundance with engineered order. Nature has been made productive on a monumental scale. Some details sound so precise that they encourage literal mapping. Plato provides measurements for canals, rings, plains, walls, and temples. The central city seems almost reconstructible. Artists have produced countless diagrams from these numbers, creating the familiar image of a circular metropolis surrounded by blue water. Yet apparent precision does not guarantee observation. Ancient authors often used measurements to create authority, symmetry, and grandeur. Plato's numbers may serve symbolic or literary purposes, and scholars still debate how consistently they can be translated into modern units. The dimensions also create practical problems. When treated literally, the resulting capital and plain can become implausibly large, depending on how the ancient measurements are understood. The island's wealth is equally structured to create contrast. Atlantis begins under rulers who retain enough of their divine inheritance to govern wisely. For many generations, they value virtue more than luxury. Their prosperity does not immediately corrupt them. Gradually, however, the mortal element within them becomes dominant. They lose balance. Wealth, power, and ambition distort the order established by Poseidon. To ordinary observers they may still appear magnificent, but Zeus recognizes their decline and decides to impose punishment. At this crucial moment, Critias breaks off. Zeus gathers the gods and prepares to speak, but the surviving text ends before his judgment is delivered. No detailed account of Atlantis sinking appears in Critias as we have it. The famous destruction is stated earlier in Timaeus, where earthquakes and floods overwhelm both the ancient Athenian forces and Atlantis within a single terrible period. Critias was apparently meant to lead toward that ending, but Plato never completes the journey, or the conclusion has not survived. This unfinished state deepens the uncertainty. We do not know exactly how Plato intended the punishment to unfold, how closely the destruction would have followed the brief version in Timaeus, or what final philosophical lesson he planned to emphasize. Later storytellers fill the silence with spectacular scenes, but the original narrative stops with the gods assembled above a civilization that does not yet understand its own danger. What survives in Plato is already rich enough: a sacred island, a naval empire, a geometrically ordered capital, a moral decline, and a catastrophe announced from the beginning. Yet the Atlantis most people imagine is a composite built over more than 2,000 years. Plato supplies the foundation. Later ages add the machinery, the occult knowledge, the racial myths, the crystal towers, and the certainty that the island must be found. To examine Atlantis seriously, those later layers must be peeled away. Beneath them stands a more disciplined and more unsettling creation, a civilization described in immense detail, placed inside a philosophical argument, and abandoned by its author at the precise moment when judgment is about to fall. The silence at the end of Critias does not merely leave the fate of Atlantis unfinished. It draws attention backward, toward the fragile chain by which the story is said to have survived at all. Plato does not claim that the island's history reached him through archives he personally examined. Instead, the account arrives through memory layered upon memory, crossing languages, families, and centuries before entering the dialogue. Its authority depends on a story about how stories are preserved, and that chain of transmission is one of the most revealing parts of the puzzle. Critias says the tale was first told to the Athenian lawgiver Solon during a journey to Egypt. Solon was already a figure of immense prestige in Greek memory: statesman, poet, reformer, and a legendary sage. By placing Atlantis in his hands, Plato connects the story to someone ancient enough to command respect but recent enough to belong to recognizable history. Solon had lived roughly 2 centuries before Plato, which created a useful distance. He was not so remote as a hero from myth, yet he was far enough the past that the details of his travels could not easily be checked. According to the dialogue, Solon visits the Egyptian city of Sai in the Nile Delta and speaks with learned priests. He attempts to impress them with Greek traditions about the oldest times, including stories of floods and heroic generations. The priests respond by telling him that the Greeks are young in memory. Greece has endured repeated catastrophes that destroyed records and reduced survivors to people without knowledge of what came before. Egypt, protected by the Nile and by a more stable environment, has preserved older accounts in temple archives. The priests then reveal that Athens once performed a great deed forgotten by the Athenians. It defeated the invading empire of Atlantis. This scene explains why no Greek tradition outside Plato preserves the event. The story was forgotten because disaster erased the records. It explains why Egypt alone remembers it. Egyptian temples are imagined as repositories of deep time, guarded by priests whose written archives reach far beyond Greek memory. It also flatters Athens by granting it a heroic past older than its known legends. The city has supposedly defended civilization thousands of years before Solon. The choice of Egypt is especially powerful. To Greeks of Plato's era, Egypt represented antiquity on a scale difficult to grasp. Its temples, monuments, rituals, and royal traditions seem to reach back toward the beginning of ordered human life. Greek travelers often treated Egyptian priests as custodians of ancient knowledge. even when their understanding of Egyptian chronology and religion was incomplete. By allowing an Egyptian priest to correct Solon, Plato reverses the assumption that Greek myths preserve the oldest truth. In this scene, Greece has forgotten its own past, while Egypt remembers it better than Greece does. Yet no known Egyptian document has been identified as the source of the Atlantis account. Egyptian inscriptions preserve wars, royal campaigns, foreign peoples, religious texts, and administrative records across long periods, but none securely describes an island empire matching Plato's Atlantis, or an ancient Athenian victory over it. This absence does not prove that every part of the story was invented, because much ancient writing has been lost. Still, the evidence remains incomplete, and the claim that temple archives at Sais contain the full account cannot presently be verified. The route from Solon to Plato is equally indirect. Solon, the story says, intended to turn the material into poetry but never completed the work. He passed it into the circle of his family and associates. Critias says he heard it as a child from an older Critias, who in turn had received it through the family tradition connected to Solon. Plato thus places several narrators between the Egyptian priests and the dialogue's audience. A child remembers an elderly relative remembering a story derived from another man's conversations abroad. The chain is carefully named, but every link depends on recollection. Oral transmission was a normal means of preserving history, genealogy, law, ritual, and poetry. Communities could carry complex narratives across generations with remarkable stability, especially when stories were repeatedly performed or attached to institutions. But family recollection is different from a formally maintained oral tradition. It can preserve vivid fragments while altering chronology, emphasis, and detail. Names may remain while motives change. A disaster may grow in scale. A distant enemy may become an empire. A place remembered vaguely may be relocated toward the edge of the known world. One influential modern argument holds that the Atlantis story does not show the features expected of a securely transmitted oral tradition independent of Plato. There is no clear evidence that the tale circulated widely before his dialogues. Later ancient references usually depend on Plato rather than on separate accounts. The supposed chain from Egypt to Solon survives only within the narrative whose authenticity it is meant to support. Plato provides both the extraordinary claim and the explanation for why it cannot be independently confirmed. That circularity has led many scholars to treat the transmission history as a literary device. Plato often uses myths, inherited stories, and reported conversations to explore philosophical problems. A tale can be introduced as ancient without functioning as literal historiography. The authority of Egypt, the prestige of Solon, and the intimacy of family memory together create a convincing frame. They make the story feel recovered rather than invented. There is also a political dimension. Solon represented law-giving, restraint, and reform. He was remembered as someone who attempted to stabilize Athens by balancing competing interests. To connect him with the story of a virtuous ancient Athens confronting an overreaching empire gives Atlantis a moral pedigree. The tale does not emerge from a sailor intoxicated by distant wonders. It comes through a lawgiver concerned with the order of states. The number of years assigned to the catastrophe intensifies the effect. The Egyptian priests placed the war between Athens and Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon. Taken literally, that pushes the event into a period long before cities, navies, metalworking empires, or anything resembling Plato's political world existed in the Aegean. Later attempts to rescue the chronology often suggest mistranslation, confusion between lunar and solar reckoning, or an extra zero introduced somewhere in transmission, a date closer to 900 years before Solon would place the story nearer the Bronze Age and make comparisons with Minoan Crete or the eruption of Thera more tempting. But no surviving textual evidence demonstrates that Plato's 9,000 years was a copying error. The immense date may instead serve the story's purpose. It creates a past beyond ordinary Greek memory, a world so ancient that only Egypt can recall it. It also allows Plato to construct an ideal Athens untouched by the complications of known history. The deeper the event is placed in time, the freer the philosopher becomes to shape it. What survives in the record suggests that the chain from Sais to Solon to Critias is not a neutral bridge to a lost archive. It is part of the architecture of the story itself. Every link adds authority, distance, and mystery. Egypt provides age, Solon provides respectability, family memory provides intimacy, catastrophe explains silence. By the time Atlantis reaches Plato's audience, it has been made both credible and unreachable. The more carefully the transmission is examined, the less it behaves like a straightforward historical report. Yet the less secure the chain becomes, the more intriguing the surviving details appear. If Plato invented the frame, why choose these places, people, numbers, and memories? If he reshaped older material, how much can still be detected? The island remains beyond the pillars, but the path leading to it now passes through the uncertain landscape of human remembrance. Memory may be uncertain, but Plato's island is not vague. Once the story passes through Egypt, Solon, and the family of Critias, it arrives in a landscape described with unusual confidence. Atlantis has mountains, plains, rivers, forests, mines, harbours, temples, roads, farms, shipyards, military districts, and a capital arranged with almost ceremonial precision. The island is not only rich, it is organised. Its wealth appears to flow from a geography in which nature and human power have been fitted together so completely that the entire country seems designed to support expansion. At the centre stands the hill where Plato is said to have lived before Poseidon enclosed it within rings of water and land. Those rings become the sacred core of the capital. Later rulers enlarge and engineer the original formation, cutting channels, building bridges, constructing walls, and opening a passage to the sea. The result is both fortress and harbour, sanctuary and royal city. Ships can move inward from the coast through a great canal toward the concentric zones, while each ring creates another boundary between the outer world and the innermost seat of power. The geometry matters. Circular cities are rare enough to feel deliberate, and Plato gives the pattern a divine origin. The rings are not merely practical defences. They preserve the shape created by Poseidon around Clito. Political authority, urban design, and sacred memory all occupy the same space. The kings rule from within a landscape that constantly reminds them that their power began as a gift from a god. At the innermost point rises a sanctuary dedicated to Poseidon and Clito. Plato describes it as enclosed, magnificent, and richly adorned. Inside stands a colossal image of Poseidon driving a chariot drawn by winged horses, surrounded by sea deities, gold, silver, ivory, and orichalcum cover surfaces throughout the sacred precinct. The temple is visually overwhelming, but its proportions are also strange by ordinary Greek standards. The effect is less one of architectural realism than accumulated grandeur. Everything at the centre is larger, brighter, and more valuable than expected. Around this sacred core, the capital becomes increasingly crowded with the machinery of the empire. There are docks filled with vessels, naval stores, workshops, barracks, race courses, baths, gardens, and houses for merchants and sailors arriving from across Atlantean territory. Plato emphasizes noise and activity. The harbours are not silent ceremonial basins. They are packed with ships, traders, traffic, and the constant movement of goods. Atlantis is wealthy because it sits at the centre of a maritime system. Its rulers control more than one island. The kingdom is divided among the 10 sons of Poseidon, each governing a region under the authority of Atlas and his descendants. Together, these rulers command a broad sphere of influence. Plato says their power extends over other islands and parts of the land beyond, as well as into territories within the Mediterranean. This gives Atlantis the structure of a confederated empire, separate royal domains tied by ancestry, ritual, and shared law. The political order is reinforced through ceremonies held in the sanctuary of Poseidon. The kings gather at appointed intervals to consult, judge disputes, and confirm their obligations. A bull is released within the sacred enclosure, and the rulers must capture it without iron weapons. After the sacrifice, they draw its blood into a vessel, mix it with wine, and swear to uphold the laws. They write judgments on golden tablets and sit together in darkness after extinguishing the sacrificial fire. The scene is solemn, archaic, and theatrical. It gives the empire a constitutional order rooted in ritual rather than simple force. No independent evidence confirms that such a royal system existed beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Yet the arrangement is revealing. Plato's not describing chaos. Atlantis begins as a disciplined society held together by law. Its rulers are not corrupt from the beginning. For generations they respect the inherited order and maintain balance between wealth and restraint. This makes their later decline more meaningful. A civilization that was always wicked would offer only a simple warning. A civilization that begins well and gradually loses proportion offers a more unsettling one. Beyond the capital lies the Great Plain, one of the most debated features in the entire account. Plato describes it as enormous, roughly rectangular, surrounded by mountains, and shaped in part by human labour. A vast ditch or canal encircles it, while smaller channels divide the interior into regular plots. Water is directed through the landscape for irrigation and transport. Produce moves toward the capital. Timber descends from the mountains. The plain supports grain, fruit, livestock, and dense settlement. Its scale is difficult to reconcile with most proposed island locations. When Plato's measurements are converted literally, the plain becomes hundreds of kilometers across. Some researchers reduce the dimensions by altering the assumed length of the ancient unit. Others argue that the numbers are symbolic, exaggerated, or corrupted. Scholars still debate whether Plato intended his measurements to be geographically plausible at all. What is clear is that the plain functions as a demonstration of controlled abundance. Atlantis has converted land into a system. The mountains surrounding it are said to be celebrated for their beauty and number. They provide villages, rivers, forests, animals, and material for construction. The island yields metals from the earth, including gold, copper, tin, and the famous orichalcum. Plato presents orichalcum as a real and valuable substance, though its precise composition remains uncertain. It may have referred to a copper alloy, perhaps something resembling brass, or to a literary metal whose significance exceeded its technical reality. Whatever it was meant to be, Atlantis uses it lavishly, especially in the walls and sacred buildings of the capital. The island also contains elephants, an unexpected detail that has repeatedly been used to argue for locations in Africa or regions once connected to warmer climates. Yet a single animal cannot securely locate a civilization. Plato may be emphasizing ecological richness, drawing from reports of distant lands, or assembling exotic features familiar to Greek audiences. Atlantis contains almost everything a powerful state could desire: fertile soil, fresh water, timber, animals, minerals, safe anchorages, and access to the open sea. Even its water supply appears unusually generous. Hot and cold springs rise near the central hill. The inhabitants build baths around them, separating facility for kings, private citizens, women, horses, and other animals. Water flows outward toward gardens and sacred groves. This detail is often compared with volcanic islands where geothermal springs are common, especially Santorini. The resemblance is suggestive, but not decisive. Hot springs existed in many parts of the ancient world and were well known to Greek writers. The capital's walls complete the image. Plato says one circuit is coated with copper, another with tin, and the innermost with the reddish gleam of orichalcum. Seen from the water, the city would have appeared as a sequence of shining bands. Whether such surfaces were structurally possible on the scale described matters less to the literary effect. Atlantis radiates wealth. Its defences are also displays. Even its fortifications announce that the state has access to materials beyond ordinary measure. Yet abundance creates the first quiet contradiction. Atlantis possesses nearly perfect natural advantages, but its rulers continue to expand. Its plains are fertile, its mountains productive, its harbours full, and its temples heavy with precious materials. Nothing in the description suggests that the empire is driven outward by hunger. Its aggression emerges from excess rather than need. That distinction places the geography within Plato's moral design. The rings, canals, walls, and fields do not merely show what Atlantis has achieved. They show how thoroughly it has mastered its environment. The island appears stable because everything is ordered, measured, enclosed, and made useful. Nature itself seems subordinated to royal power. But the shape of the city still comes from Poseidon, and the laws still depend on divine inheritance. The rulers control the landscape only so long as they remain worthy of the order they received. What survives in the text suggests a civilization built around the illusion of permanence. Stone, metal, canals, fleets, mountains, and sacred genealogy all seem to promise endurance. The capital sits behind ring after ring of protection. The empire possesses more resources than it can reasonably consume. Its kings gather beneath golden images and renew laws believed to come from a god. Yet the story has already told us that the sea will close over everything. The greater the city becomes, the more complete its disappearance will seem. The city behind those shining walls does not fall in isolation. Plato gives Atlantis an opponent, and that opponent is almost as strange as the island itself. Long before the Athens known from classical history, there is said to have existed another Athens, older, disciplined, and nearly forgotten. Its people live beneath the protection of Athena and Hephaestus. Its warriors are separated from farmers and craftsmen. Its laws preserve balance between social groups. Its citizens possess neither the luxury of Atlantis nor its vast maritime reach. Yet they are presented as more stable because they have not allowed wealth to become the measure of order. This ancient Athens matters because Atlantis is not introduced merely as a lost city. It is introduced as an imperial threat. The island's rulers extend their authority over neighbouring territories and then push eastward through the pillars of Heracles into the Mediterranean. Their expansion reaches Libya as far as Egypt and Europe, as far as the region Plato calls Tyrrhenia, usually associated with parts of central Italy. The campaign is therefore vast. Atlantis is not raiding a coast or competing for a single harbour. It is attempting to bring much of the known world under one power. Against this movement stands Athens, at first supported by allies. As the conflict intensifies, those allies fall away. The Athenians are left alone, yet they continue resisting. They defeat the invading force, liberate peoples already subjected to Atlantis, and preserve the independence of those not yet conquered. In Plato's compressed account, the victory is total enough to sound legendary. A single city, representing civic virtue, defeats an empire whose resources appear nearly unlimited. The contrast is deliberate. Atlantis possesses abundance, ships, metals, canals, royal dynasties, and a capital designed to impress every visitor. Ancient Athens is defined less by material wealth than by character. Its soil is poorer, its way of life is austere, its military class lives communally and owns little. The city's strength comes from discipline and a social order that Plato's speakers regard as just. Atlantis expands because it has lost restraint. Athens resists because it still possesses it. This idealized Athens resembles the political society described elsewhere in Plato's work more than it resembles any securely reconstructed prehistoric settlement. The guardians are trained for defense. Property is limited among the warrior class. Civic duty outweighs private enrichment. Men and women within the guardian group are described as sharing military responsibilities, a feature connected to Plato's broader political thought. The population is carefully ordered, and public life is shaped by education and law. The ancient city becomes an imagined demonstration of what a virtuous state might do when confronted by overwhelming power. The geography of this primeval Athens is also revealing. Critias describes Attica as once more fertile than it was in Plato's own time. The land had deeper soil, more forests, stronger springs, and greater agricultural capacity. Over long periods, erosion stripped the countryside, leaving only the skeleton of what had once existed. Plato compares the surviving landscape to the wasted body of a sick person. This is one of the most grounded observations in the entire Atlantis narrative. The Greek world had experienced deforestation, soil loss, and changing water systems, and Plato appears aware that landscapes can deteriorate over generations. The destruction of soil serves as a quiet parallel to the destruction of civilizations. Athens loses memory, fertility, and physical evidence. Atlantis loses everything beneath the sea. Both landscapes become incomplete archives. One survives as eroded ground, the other as a vanished island. In each case, later people are left with fragments and explanations that cannot be fully tested. The war itself receives surprisingly little tactical detail. Plato does not describe formations, weapons, commanders, naval maneuvers, or individual acts of heroism. The emphasis remains moral and political. Athens wins because its institutions are better ordered. Atlantis loses because strength without virtue has become unstable. The conflict functions less like a military chronicle than a philosophical experiment in which two forms of society are placed under pressure. This creates another difficulty for anyone attempting to treat the account as literal history. A war of such scale should have left traces across many regions. An empire extending from the Atlantic into North Africa and Europe would likely have produced material evidence. Trading networks, settlements, fortifications, inscriptions, distinctive technologies, or traditions among the peoples it conquered. No accepted archaeological culture matches the Atlantean system described by Plato at the date he gives. 9,000 years before Solon, The societies of the Mediterranean and Atlantic world were not building fleets and imperial capitals on the scale required by the story. Some researchers therefore compress the chronology. They argue that the 9,000 years should be read as 900, perhaps because of a translation error or a difference in Egyptian counting. This brings the war closer to the Late Bronze Age, when complex palatial societies, long-distance trade, powerful fleets, and large-scale conflict genuinely existed around the eastern Mediterranean. It also places the story nearer the eruption of Thera and the later collapse of several Bronze Age powers. The adjustment is attractive because it makes the world more archaeologically plausible. Yet the correction has no firm textual basis. Plato repeatedly emphasizes the enormous antiquity of the event. The Egyptian priest's central point is that Greek memory does not reach far enough into the past. Reducing the date to 900 years weakens that dramatic structure. It may solve one problem while creating another. Scholars still debate whether the chronology is symbolic, mistaken, deliberately exaggerated, or simply part of an invented setting. There is also the question of why both Athens and Atlantis disappear from ordinary memory after the war. In Timaeus, the catastrophe follows the victory. Earthquakes and floods strike within a single terrible span of time. The Athenian warriors are swallowed by the earth, while Atlantis sinks into the sea. The victors do not return to celebrate. The defeated empire does not leave refugees who preserve its name. The entire struggle is erased almost as soon as it is completed. This double destruction gives the story an unusual shape. Atlantis is punished, but Athens also suffers. Virtue wins the political contest and still cannot escape natural catastrophe. Plato does not suggest that moral excellence grants immunity from geology. The best-ordered state can resist tyranny, yet its citizens remain vulnerable to forces beyond human control. The lesson is therefore darker than a simple tale of good defeating evil. The ancient Athenians vanish below their own land, while the island empire disappears beneath the ocean. Later, Athenians inherit neither the full memory of the victory nor the institutions that supposedly made it possible. Their city must be told about its greatest deed by foreign priests. Even triumph becomes fragile when records, landscapes, and generations are broken. This forgotten Athens is often pushed aside in popular Atlantis stories because it complicates the search for a real island. If Atlantis is treated as a map puzzle, ancient Athens becomes an inconvenience. If the account is read as political philosophy, Athens moves to the center. The story is not simply about where Atlantis stood. It is about what kind of society can withstand power, what happens when wealth becomes detached from restraint, and how even the most important human achievements can be lost when memory fails. Across the sea, the Atlantean fleet appears almost limitless. Behind it stands a capital built in sacred circles, supplied by a plane engineered for abundance. Facing it is a poorer city, whose strength lies in order rather than spectacle. Plato allows that city to win, then removes it from history. The empire is defeated, the victors are buried, the landscape changes, the records vanish. What remains is not the memory of a war, but a philosophical shadow cast across deep time. The shadow becomes most difficult to follow at the point where Plato gives it a date. 9,000 years before Solon, the Egyptian priest says, ancient Athens confronted Atlantis. Taken literally, that places the war around the middle of the 10th millennium BCE, near the end of the last ice age. Sea levels were still rising from their glacial lows. Vast coastlines, now submerged, remained exposed. Human community occupied Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. but the archaeological record reveals no metal-rich naval empires, monumental canal cities, organized chariot forces, or political systems resembling those described in Critias. The date seems to open a door into deep prehistory, only for the material evidence on the other side to refuse almost everything Plato places there. Around 9600 BCE, agriculture was emerging in parts of Southwest Asia, but it had not yet produced the large urban civilizations familiar from later millennia. Permanent settlements existed, and some communities constructed impressive ritual architecture. As sites such as Göbekli Tepe demonstrate, human societies were capable of cooperation, planning, symbolism, seafaring, exchange, and engineering long before the first states appeared. Yet that is not the same as evidence for an empire commanding fleets, mines, armies, canals, and territories across the Atlantic and Mediterranean worlds. No archaeological culture from the period matches Atlantis as Plato describes it. This mismatch has inspired one of the oldest strategies in Atlantis research: change the number. If 9,000 years becomes 900, the story moves forward into the second millennium BCE. Suddenly the setting seems more familiar. Bronze Age palaces dominate parts of the Aegean. Minoan ships travel between islands. Egyptian records describe foreign peoples and distant campaigns. The city of Akrotiri flourishes on Thera before being buried by volcanic ash. Mycenaean centres rise on the Greek mainland. Complex trade networks connect metals, pottery, timber, oil, wine, textiles, and luxury goods across the eastern Mediterranean. The attraction is obvious. A 900-year interval between Solon and the catastrophe would place Atlantis somewhere near the age of Minoan Crete, Thera, or the wider Bronze Age world. The technological contradictions would become less severe. Ships, bronze weapons, chariots, palaces, hydraulic systems, and long-distance commerce would all belong to the right general era. The story could then be interpreted as a distorted memory of real events carried through centuries of retelling. Several explanations have been proposed for how the number might have changed. Some suggest that an Egyptian symbol for 100 was mistaken for 1000. Others argue that lunar months were converted into solar years, producing a date far older than intended. A popular calculation divides 9,000 by roughly 12 and arrives near 750 years, again pulling the story closer to the Bronze Age. Another proposal imagines that Egyptian priests counted seasons rather than full years. These solutions are ingenious, but they remain speculative. No surviving manuscript demonstrates that Plato's text once read 900, and no Egyptian source has been found containing the original figures. The lunar month theory is especially appealing because it appears mathematical, but it creates new difficulties. Ancient Egyptians were fully capable of distinguishing months from years. Their administrative, religious, and astronomical traditions depended on careful calendrical reckoning. It is difficult to explain why priests presented as guardians of ancient records would confuse the two, or why Solon would translate the figure without noticing that a civilization supposedly existed in a technological world thousands of years before any known Greek tradition. The theory rescues the date by assuming a mistake for which there is no direct evidence. Changing the number also does not solve every problem. Even if Atlantis is moved to around 1500 BCE, Plato's idealized Athens still fails to match the archaeological picture cleanly. Mainland Greece at that time contained Mycenaean palace societies, not the austere guardian state described in Critias. The geography, dimensions, imperial reach, and concentric capital remain difficult to reconcile with Thera, Crete, or any single known Bronze Age centre. Reducing the chronology makes some features more plausible while leaving others untouched. The possibility of scribal error must also be considered. Ancient texts survived through copying, and numbers were vulnerable to corruption. A misplaced mark or misunderstood numeral could alter a date dramatically. Yet the Atlantis chronology is not preserved as an isolated number without context. Plato repeatedly builds the story around extreme antiquity. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that Greeks are children in historical memory, because repeated disasters have erased their records. Ancient Athens is presented as older than Greek tradition. The 9,000-year distance supports the entire scene. It is not merely a measurement that can be removed without affecting the structure. Deep time gives Plato freedom. A story placed a few centuries before Solon would overlap with remembered dynasties, known wars, and surviving genealogies. Listeners could compare it with Homer, Egyptian kings, Phoenician expansion, or the rise of Greek cities. A story placed 9,000 years earlier exists beyond ordinary verification. It belongs to a remote age in which landscapes, peoples, and political systems may be shaped according to philosophical purpose. The enormous date does not weaken the narrative inside the dialogue, it protects it. Numbers in ancient literature often carry symbolic weight. 10 kings divide Atlantis. The city is arranged in repeated circles. Measurements produce symmetry. The war occurs 9,000 years before Solon, while Egyptian civilization is portrayed as preserving cycles of destruction and renewal across immense spans. Plato may not be using chronology in the modern archaeological sense. The date may signal a world outside conventional memory, just as the location beyond the pillars signals a place outside ordinary Greek geography. There is another possibility Plato may be magnifying a much younger tradition intentionally. A real earthquake, flood, war, or island disaster could have been displaced backward to make it universal. Historical memory often expands under literary pressure. A regional catastrophe becomes the destruction of an entire world. A hostile maritime power becomes a transcontinental empire. Several centuries become several millennia. This process does not require fraud. It is one of the ways stories acquire moral scale. The end of the Ice Age does provide a setting filled with real transformations. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea level rose by more than 100 meters. Coastal plains disappeared. Islands formed where hills had once stood above lowlands. River valleys became bays. Communities moved as shorelines advanced. The English Channel widened. The North Sea covered Doggerland. The Persian Gulf filled. Large parts of the Sunda Shelf vanished beneath tropical waters. These were not single-day events, but they altered the inhabited world across generations and occasionally included rapid pulses of sea level rise. Such changes make a memory of drowned land conceivable, but they do not confirm Atlantis. A submerged coastal plain is not a metal-rich island empire. The existence of real post-glacial flooding shows that human landscapes disappeared. Not that Plato preserved an exact report from 9600 BCE. The distinction is essential. Geological possibility can explain why stories of lost lands feel plausible, but it cannot supply the missing archaeology. The date has nevertheless encouraged claims that Atlantis belonged to an advanced civilization erased at the end of the Ice Age. In these reconstructions, the absence of evidence becomes part of the explanation. The cities lie beneath the sea. The records were destroyed, and later societies inherited only fragments of knowledge. Yet this reasoning is difficult to test. Any missing evidence can be attributed to the catastrophe itself. The claim becomes protected from disproof in the same way Plato's remote chronology protects the original tale from historical comparison. Archaeology does not require every trace of an empire to survive, but a civilization of the size described would be expected to leave more than one drowned capital. Mining changes landscapes, trade distributes objects, colonies produce local material cultures, ships carry pottery, tools, metals, weights, and symbols across wide regions. Armies leave weapons and fortifications. Populations leave genetic and dietary signatures. No coherent pattern from the 10th millennium BCE points toward an Atlantean system spanning the Atlantic and Mediterranean. What the date reveals most clearly is not where Atlantis existed, but how the story operates. 9,000 years creates awe, distance, and loss. It makes Egypt ancient enough to remember what Greece has forgotten. It allows Athens to possess a heroic past beyond Homer. It turns Atlantis from a fallen kingdom into a civilization from another human age. The number may preserve an error, an exaggeration, a symbolic interval, or Plato's deliberate invention. No single explanation fully accounts for it, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet every attempt to correct the chronology moves the island into a different story. At 9,000 years, Atlantis belongs to deep prehistory without archaeological support. At 900, it begins to resemble the Bronze Age but no longer fits Plato's framing as neatly. The puzzle does not disappear when the date is changed. It simply shifts its shape. If the chronology refuses to settle, the earth beneath the story is less cooperative still. Plato's catastrophe is abrupt earthquakes and floods strike. Armies disappear into the ground, and Atlantis sinks beneath the sea. Read literally, it sounds almost too complete, as though an entire civilization is removed in a single motion. Geology rarely behaves with such narrative neatness. Islands do collapse, coasts do drown, harbours do vanish. Cities are destroyed by earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and sudden changes in the shoreline. Yet the process by which land is lost is usually more complicated than a continent dropping whole into the ocean. The Mediterranean is one of the most active geological regions on Earth. Africa moves slowly northward against Eurasia, deforming the crust between them. Faults cut through Greece, Anatolia, Italy, North Africa, and the Aegean. Earthquakes have repeatedly damaged ancient cities, shifted coastlines, altered springs, and lowered or raised sections of land. Volcanic arcs run through the region, including the islands of the southern Aegean. To people living before modern geology, the ground could seem stable for generations and then betray that assumption within minutes. A strong earthquake does not need to swallow a city completely to erase its function. Walls collapse, wells become blocked, roads split, harbours rise above the water or sink below it. Fires spread through dense settlements. Fields are buried beneath landslides. A city that survives physically may no longer survive economically. Its trade routes shift, its population disperses, and later, rebuilding covers the ruins. What looks from a distance like one disaster may actually be the final blow in a long decline. Tsunamis add another layer, undersea earthquakes, submarine landslides, volcanic collapses, and eruptions can displace enormous volumes of water. Near the source, waves may arrive quickly, with little warning. They can strip coastlines, carry ships inland, fill harbours with debris, and leave layers of sand across low-lying settlements. The sea first withdraws in some cases, exposing the seabed, then returns with destructive force. Such events are rare on the scale of a human lifetime, but their memory can persist because they violate the ordinary rhythm of the coast. Ancient communities had no concept of tectonic plates, but they understood that land and sea could exchange places. Greek and Roman writers preserved reports of earthquakes, islands appearing, islands disappearing, and cities overwhelmed by water. Some accounts were exaggerated, yet many were rooted in real events. The city of Helika in Greece, destroyed in the 4th century BCE, became one of antiquity's most famous examples. Earthquake and flooding devastated it, and later writers described its ruins beneath the water. The disaster occurred during Plato's lifetime or close to it, depending on the exact chronology of his works. Scholars still debate whether Helike influenced the Atlantis story, but it demonstrates that the image of a drowned city was not remote fantasy to a Greek audience. Even where the sea does not advance dramatically, the land itself can sink. This process, called subsidence, may occur through fault movement, sediment compaction, volcanic activity, or the slow adjustment of the crust. A few meters of downward movement can permanently flood a coastal district. Over centuries, smaller changes accumulate. Streets disappear beneath shallow water. Foundations become reefs. A harbour once protected by walls becomes an offshore ruin. The opposite also happens. Earthquakes can lift coastlines, leaving ancient docks stranded above the modern sea. Archaeologists sometimes find harbour installations several meters from the water they once served. These changes reveal that coastlines are not fixed boundaries. They are temporary arrangements between rock, sediment, water, and time. Volcanic islands are even less stable. They're built from repeated eruptions, often rising steeply from the seabed. Their slopes may be weakened by fractures, hydrothermal alteration, and the weight of newly accumulated lava. Large flank collapses can send masses of rock into the ocean and generate tsunamis. Calderas form when magma chambers empty and the ground above them collapses. The resulting landscape may resemble an island shattered around a flooded centre. This has made volcanic settings especially attractive in the search for Atlantis. A circular harbour can be compared to a caldera. Hot and cold springs fit geothermal islands. Layers of ash suggest sudden destruction. A maritime culture living near a volcano provides the human setting. Yet resemblance must be handled carefully. Many volcanic islands contain these features, and Plato's concentric city is an engineered capital, not simply a crater. Geology can produce suggestive shapes without producing the civilization described in the text. The Atlantic presents a different problem. The ocean floor is not a drowned continent waiting just beneath the waves. Most of it consists of dense oceanic crust formed at spreading ridges and recycled at subduction zones over geological time. Large continental landmasses do not ordinarily sink intact into deep ocean basins within human history. This is one of the clearest obstacles to older theories that imagined Atlantis as a continent occupying the middle of the Atlantic and collapsing suddenly. There are, however, genuine submerged plateaus, seamounts, volcanic islands, and fragments of continental crust beneath the oceans. Some were once above sea level. Erosion, cooling, subsidence, and changes in sea level later drowned them. The discovery of such features often produces headlines invoking Atlantis, because the comparison is irresistible. A mountain beneath the waves seems to offer the outline of a lost island, but geological age matters. A landform that vanished tens of millions of years before humans existed cannot preserve a memory of an ancient civilization. The seamounts north of the Canary Islands illustrate this divide between geological wonder and archaeological evidence. Researchers have mapped a submarine complex formed from several volcanic structures and named it Los Atlantes, within a scientific project whose title consciously echoes the legend. Parts of the complex may once have stood above water during the Eocene, tens of millions of years ago. The discovery is real and important for understanding volcanic evolution around the Canaries. It is not evidence for Plato's island. No humans existed when those ancient summits were exposed. The comparison remains useful because it shows how islands can rise and vanish over deep time. Volcanic chains are not permanent. New cones emerge, old ones erode. The crust beneath them cools and sinks. Waves flatten exposed summits into broad platforms before the sea covers them completely. Beneath modern oceans lie the remains of landscapes that sunlight once touched. The world contains many drowned islands, but almost all belong to geological timescales far removed from human memory. Sea level change offers the most direct connection to vanished human landscapes. During the last ice age, vast quantities of water were locked in continental ice sheets. Global sea level stood more than 100 meters below its modern position. Shores extended far beyond today's coastlines. Rivers crossed plains that are now seabed. Islands were connected to continents. As the climate warmed and ice melted, the ocean advanced unevenly across these lowlands. For generations, people would have watched familiar places disappear. A hunting ground became marsh, a freshwater valley turned brackish, a ridge became an island, a shoreline moved inland, sometimes slowly enough to follow, sometimes quickly enough to disrupt whole communities. Storm surges and local collapses would have made the larger transformation seem sudden, even when the long-term rise unfolded across centuries. This process created countless real lost worlds, yet it rarely resembled a great island sinking vertically. More often, the sea moved horizontally across low coastal terrain. The highest ground survived longest. Settlements were abandoned, rebuilt farther inland, or submerged in stages. Organic material decayed. Waves scattered structures. Later sediments buried what remained. Archaeologists studying these landscapes face a difficult record because the most heavily inhabited coastal zones are now among the hardest places to investigate. The destruction of Atlantis may therefore combine several different kinds of catastrophe into one compressed image. Earthquake explains the violent motion of the ground. Flooding explains the loss of armies and cities. Subsidence explains permanent submergence. Tsunami explains sudden devastation. Long-term sea level rise explains the broader human memory of disappearing shores. Plato joins these forces into a single day and night, because stories concentrate what geology disperses. No single explanation fully accounts for his account. A tsunami can destroy a coast but not erase a vast island empire without leaving wider traces. Subsidence can drown a city, but usually not an entire continent in hours. Volcanic collapse can transform an island dramatically, yet the scale and geography remain difficult. Post-glacial sea level rise can swallow enormous territories, but not with the suddenness Plato describes. What survives in the record suggests something more subtle than confirmation. The natural world provided ancient storytellers with every element needed to imagine Atlantis cities ruined by earthquakes, shores erased by waves, islands reshaped by volcanoes, and inhabited plains lost beneath rising seas. The catastrophe is geologically possible in parts, but not proven as one event. The Earth does not reveal Plato's island. It reveals why his audience could believe that land itself was capable of disappearance. Among all the landscapes proposed for Atlantis, one rises from the Aegean with unusual force. Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera, is a broken volcanic island surrounding a flooded caldera. Its cliffs expose layers of ash and lava. Beneath those deposits lies Akrotiri, a Bronze Age settlement preserved with streets, houses, stairways, drainage systems, storage rooms, workshops, and painted walls. Here, a maritime society flourished before a major eruption transformed the island. The resemblance to parts of Plato's story is immediate enough to feel almost inevitable a prosperous island culture. Strong connections to the sea, advanced architecture, earthquakes, volcanic destruction, and a landscape that appears to have collapsed into the water. For more than a century, these parallels have made Thera the most persuasive real-world candidate for a historical memory behind Atlantis. Yet the closer the comparison becomes, the less complete the fit appears. Before the eruption, Thera occupied an important position within the Bronze Age Aegean. Its inhabitants participated in the wider cultural and trading world commonly associated with Minoan Crete. Ships moved between islands carrying pottery, metals, food, timber, textiles, and luxury goods. Akrotiri's buildings reveal a community far removed from the image of an isolated volcanic outpost. Some structures rose several stories. Rooms were decorated with elaborate frescoes showing ships, landscapes, animals, plants, ceremonies, and human figures. Stone-lined streets ran between closely built houses. Drainage channels carried wastewater beneath parts of the settlement. Storage vessels held agricultural products and traded goods. What survives suggests a prosperous town deeply connected to regional networks. Its frescoes are especially haunting because they preserve a world in motion. Boats travel between coastal settlements. Dolphins move through blue water. Monkeys climb across rocky terrain. Flowers bend in painted landscapes. The scenes do not document Atlantis, but they reveal how visually rich an Aegean maritime society could be long before Plato. A later storyteller did not need to invent the idea of elegant island communities supported by ships and trade. The Bronze Age had already produced them. Then the island began to change. Earthquakes damaged buildings, and some structures were repaired before the final eruption. At some point, volcanic activity intensified. The inhabitants appear to have recognized the danger and left, at least from the excavated parts of Akrotiri. Unlike Pompeii, where human remains preserve the suddenness of disaster, Akrotiri has yielded few clear victims of the main eruption. Valuable portable objects were removed from many buildings. This suggests evacuation, perhaps during an interval between earthquakes and the most destructive volcanic phases. The eruption itself was one of the largest known in the ancient Mediterranean. Ash rose high into the atmosphere and spread across the region. Pyroclastic material buried Akrotiri beneath thick deposits, preserving walls and objects that would otherwise have disappeared. Parts of the volcanic structure collapsed, contributing to the formation or enlargement of the caldera now filled by the sea. Tsunamis may have struck neighbouring islands and the coast of Crete, though their exact scale and consequences remain debated. The event transformed Thera physically and disrupted life across the southern Aegean. To an observer approaching the modern island, the landscape seems almost designed to encourage comparison with Plato. The sea occupies the centre. Steep cliffs form an irregular ring. Smaller islands rise within the caldera. Hot springs and volcanic gases remain active. It is easy to imagine that a single immense island once stood where open water now lies. In reality, the geological history is more complicated. Thera experienced repeated eruptions and caldera-forming events over hundreds of thousands of years. The Bronze Age eruption did not cause an entire large continent to sink. It destroyed and reshaped parts of an existing volcanic archipelago. Chronology creates another obstacle. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, far earlier than the Bronze Age. Even if the figure is reduced to 900 years, the match is approximate rather than exact. The date of the Thera eruption itself remains one of the most contested problems in Mediterranean archaeology. Radiocarbon evidence has often supported a date in the later 17th century BCE, while traditional archaeological chronologies linked to Egyptian history have sometimes favoured a date closer to the 16th century BCE. Recent research continues to refine the sequence, but no universally accepted year has settled the debate. This uncertainty matters because the eruption must be placed within the rise and decline of Minoan civilization. The great palaces of Crete did not disappear immediately when Thera erupted. Knossos and other centres continued functioning afterward. Minoan influence remained strong for a time, though trade, agriculture, shipping, and political stability may have suffered disruption. Some scholars argue that the eruption weakened the wider system and made later upheavals more damaging. Others caution that the evidence does not support a simple chain in which Thera erupts and Minoan civilization instantly collapses. Roughly a century or more after the eruption, several Cretan palace centres experienced destruction, and Mycenaean influence from mainland Greece became increasingly visible. Knossos continued under a changed political order. The causes remain debated: warfare, internal conflict, economic disruption, shifting trade networks, earthquakes, and Mycenaean expansion may all have played roles. The eruption belongs to this long transformation, but no single explanation fully accounts for the end of Minoan political dominance. The differences between Thera and Atlantis are substantial. Thera was much smaller than the island Plato describes. Its known settlements did not command an empire spanning the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Akrotiri was not built as a series of concentric rings, and the island lies inside the Aegean rather than beyond the Pillars of Heracles. There is no evidence of a war between Thera and an idealized prehistoric Athens. The volcanic destruction did not occur around 9600 BCE. Elephants, the enormous rectangular plain, the 10 royal kingdoms, and the immense canal system find no clear equivalents there. Crete offers a broader comparison. The Minoans possessed palaces, sophisticated art, extensive trade routes, and strong maritime connections. Greek traditions remembered King Minos, labyrinths, tribute, and Cretan power. A distorted memory of Minoan civilization might explain some of the political and nautical character of Atlantis better than Thera alone. Yet Crete did not sink, and its principal centres were not destroyed in one day and night. Combining Minoan Crete with volcanic Thera produces a closer resemblance, but it also reveals the method different features from different places and events are being assembled into a single candidate. That does not make the connection meaningless. Plato may never have intended a one-to-one geographical report. A philosopher working centuries after the Bronze Age could have inherited fragmented traditions about powerful island societies, vanished towns, volcanic destruction, ancient wars, and political decline. These fragments might have merged with observations of contemporary empires and with his own ideas about moral order. Atlantis could be a literary construction built partly from the ruins of real history. The question is whether such memories could survive from the 17th or 16th century BCE into Plato's 4th century world. More than 1,000 years separate the eruption from the dialogues. During that interval, palace systems collapsed, scripts disappeared from use, populations shifted, and oral traditions changed. Yet Greek culture preserved distorted memories of Bronze Age places and conflicts in epic poetry. Mycenae, Troy, Crete, and other centres remained present in legend even when their historical forms were misunderstood. It is therefore possible that some memory of Aegean catastrophe endured. Though the path from Thera to Atlantis cannot be traced securely, Akrotiri makes the temptation stronger because it resembles the kind of discovery Atlantis seekers hope to find. Beneath volcanic ash is a real town frozen in a lost age. Its streets can be walked, its vessels, furniture impressions, tools, and paintings can be studied. Its architecture reveals a society more complex than later generations once imagined possible for that time. It demonstrates that the ancient world contained extraordinary places capable of vanishing from memory until archaeology brought them back. Yet Akrotiri also teaches restraint. The more clearly the site is understood, the less necessary it becomes to call it Atlantis. Its own story is remarkable enough. It belongs to a specific Aegean culture, a specific volcanic landscape, and a specific period of Bronze Age history. Turning it into Plato's island can obscure what the evidence actually reveals. Thera may have supplied a memory, an image, or only a modern analogy. The flooded caldera, buried town, and maritime setting make the connection difficult to ignore. But resemblance is not identity. What survives beneath the ash shows that real disasters can preserve the outlines of lost worlds. It does not show that Plato was describing this island. The Aegean offers something more subtle not Atlantis found, but a demonstration of how history can create the raw material from which Atlantis becomes imaginable. Once Thera is allowed to remain Thera, the search expands again. The island returns to the western horizon, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where Plato originally placed it. Maps are unfolded across Iberia, North Africa, the Atlantic archipelagos, and the shallow continental shelves near the Strait of Gibraltar. Every unusual circle, drowned ridge, marsh, seamount, ruin, and ancient coastline becomes a possible fragment. The farther the search moves from the Aegean, the better the geography sometimes appears to fit. Yet the cultural and chronological problems usually grow more severe. Southern Spain has attracted particular attention because it lies close to the Atlantic entrance of the Mediterranean. The region around Cádiz, the Guadalquivir River, and the wetlands of Doñana contains a long history of seafaring, trade, shifting estuaries, earthquakes, tsunamis, and settlements built near unstable coastlines. Ancient Tartessos, known through fragmentary Greek and Near Eastern references as a wealthy society in southwestern Iberia, has often been drawn into the Atlantis debate. Its association with metals, river trade, and the far west makes it tempting to imagine that Plato transformed a real Iberian culture into his oceanic empire. The problem is chronology. Tartessian culture flourished mainly during the early 1st millennium BCE, far too late for Plato's stated date, and still centuries later than the Minoan catastrophe. It was prosperous, but it was not a continent-sized naval empire. Its settlements and material culture belong to a recognizable Iron Age world connected with Phoenician trade. Calling Tartessos Atlantis replaces one complex historical society with another name rather than explaining Plato's account. The landscape itself has encouraged broader proposals. Doñana is a vast system of marshes, dunes as channels, and buried coastal features. Geological studies show that tsunamis and storms have repeatedly affected the Gulf of Cádiz. Ancient settlements near estuaries could have been damaged, abandoned, covered by sediment, or isolated as waterways shifted. Satellite imagery has occasionally revealed geometric patterns beneath fields and wetlands, producing claims that concentric structures may lie hidden below the surface. Such images require caution. Natural channels, Old field boundaries are drainage works, modern roads, and differences in soil moisture can create shapes that appear architectural from above. Circular patterns are especially powerful because the human eye quickly organizes incomplete forms into meaningful designs. A few arcs can become Plato's rings before excavation has shown that any walls exist. More recent claims have shifted offshore. Sonar and LiDAR surveys near Cádiz have been presented as evidence of large underwater structures, sometimes described as concentric walls, harbour works, or engineered ruins. The images are visually compelling, and the location beyond Gibraltar gives them immediate dramatic force. Yet sonar does not directly photograph an ancient city. It records differences in depth, texture, and reflected sound. Rock formations, sand ridges, reefs, erosion channels, shipwreck debris, and later construction can all produce regular-looking patterns. The crucial work begins after the striking image appears. Archaeologists must establish whether the features are artificial, recover datable material, identify construction methods, map their relationship to ancient shorelines, and place them within a known cultural sequence. Until that work is independently reviewed and replicated, the structures remain claims rather than confirmed ruins. Each generation seems to announce that Atlantis has finally surfaced, but headlines often arrive long before the evidence. This pattern is not new. Earlier reports placed Atlantis beneath Spanish mudflats after researchers linked satellite photographs with tsunami deposits and possible circular structures. The announcement travelled widely because it offered the perfect combination of technology and legend. Remote sensing appeared to reveal what centuries of searching had missed. Critics noted, however, that the proposed features were uncertain, the archaeological context weak, and the interpretation shaped too heavily by Plato before the site had been securely understood. The lost city existed first in the headline, and only tentatively in the ground. Farther south, the coast of Morocco has also been proposed. Some researchers identify ancient harbours, unusual rock formations, or broad plains that appear to resemble parts of Plato's description. North Africa offers elephants, mountains, mineral resources, Atlantic access, and regions affected by earthquakes. It lies close enough to Gibraltar to fit the idea of a Western power confronting the Mediterranean, yet no site has produced the combination required: the concentric capital, the immense island, the prehistoric empire, and the catastrophic destruction. The Richat Structure in Mauritania creates an even more dramatic image. Seen from above, it resembles a vast eye pressed into the Sahara. Rings of rock spread outward for roughly 40 kilometers, producing a pattern that looks uncannily like modern illustrations of Atlantis. Roads, dry channels, and eroded ridges cross the circles. To those already searching for Plato's city, the resemblance can feel less like coincidence than recognition. Geology tells a different story. Richat is an eroded geological dome formed from layers of sedimentary and volcanic rock, uplifted above a deeper magmatic intrusion. Over immense spans of time, erosion exposed rocks of different resistance, creating the concentric pattern. It is not an impact crater, a collapsed city, or an engineered harbour. Its rings are measured in geological time, not built by human labour. The location also creates serious difficulties. Richat lies far inland in the modern Sahara. Supporters argue that ancient waterways, wetter climatic conditions, or catastrophic flooding once connected it to the Atlantic. North Africa did experience major environmental shifts during the African humid period. Lakes, rivers, grasslands, and human communities spread across regions now dominated by desert. Yet the periods of greatest moisture do not transform Richat into Plato's maritime capital, and no archaeological evidence establishes an empire there matching his account. The visual similarity remains powerful because concentricity is one of the few features of Atlantis that can be recognized instantly. Once the rings are seen, mountains, channels, salt deposits, and surrounding plains are interpreted around them. But Plato's city contained alternating rings of land and navigable water built around a small central hill. Richat consists of exposed geological strata on a scale and in a setting that do not fit the text without extensive reinterpretation. The candidate resembles the modern picture of Atlantis more closely than it resembles the full description. The Canary Islands offer another Atlantic possibility. They lie beyond Gibraltar, rise from deep ocean water, and preserve dramatic volcanic landscapes. Their indigenous history, unusual ecology, and isolation once encouraged speculative theories connecting them with surviving Atlantean peaks. Modern geology confirms that the islands are volcanic, and that older islands and seamounts in the region have eroded and subsided. Some summits now beneath the sea were once exposed above it. In 2024, marine geologists announced the mapping of a submarine complex north of the Canaries, composed of 3 volcanic structures. They named it Los Atlantes as part of an oceanographic project already inspired by the legend. Some parts may have been islands during the Eocene, between roughly 56 and 34 million years ago. The discovery offered a real sunken island landscape, and one researcher compared its history to the motif of Atlantis. The comparison was poetic, not archaeological. These volcanoes vanished tens of millions of years before humans existed. They cannot preserve a memory carried to Egypt or Greece. Their importance lies in geology. They show that Atlantic islands genuinely rise, erode, and sink below the waves. They do not show that Plato knew of them. Other proposed locations range across the Mediterranean and beyond. Malta offers monumental prehistoric temples and evidence of changing sea levels. Sardinia provides towers, coastal plains, and Bronze Age societies. Sicily has volcanic destruction and ancient maritime power. Anatolia contains cities ruined by earthquakes and traditions carried through Greek memory. The Black Sea has inspired theories involving postglacial flooding. The Azores sit dramatically in the mid-Atlantic. Some searches travel even farther, toward the Caribbean, Antarctica, or imagine continents beneath deep water. Each candidate succeeds by emphasizing a few details and relaxing others. A volcanic island explains catastrophe but not location. A site beyond Gibraltar explains geography but not chronology. A circular landform explains the rings but not the archaeology. A wealthy Bronze Age culture explains maritime power but not the 9,000-year date. A submerged geological feature explains a sunken island but predates humanity. No single place accommodates the entire account without altering Plato's measurements, dates, directions, scale, or political history. This may reveal less about Atlantis than about the method of searching for it. The description is broad enough to generate resemblances across many landscapes. Mountains, plains, metals, earthquakes, harbours, circles, and drowned coasts occur in numerous regions. Once a candidate is chosen, the text becomes flexible. Contradictory details are labelled symbolic or corrupted, while matching details are treated literally. The Western search therefore deepens the puzzle without resolving it. Iberia contains real ancient wealth and tsunami-scarred shores. North Africa preserves enormous climatic and geological transformations. The Canaries rise above drowned volcanic worlds. The Atlantic seabed holds seamounts that once stood in sunlight. All of these are genuine and extraordinary. None has yet yielded Plato's empire. Beyond the pillars, the map is no longer empty, but the island remains absent. Modern instruments can measure the seabed, penetrate sediment, and reconstruct coastlines hidden for thousands of years. They reveal a world far stranger than ancient geography imagined. Yet every new ridge and buried channel also demonstrates how easily a natural feature can be mistaken for the outline of a desired city. The search moves westward, and Atlantis continues to move just ahead of it. Atlantis becomes easier to imagine when attention shifts away from one legendary island and toward the many real landscapes now hidden beneath modern seas. The ocean floor is not empty. In shallow coastal waters across the world lie drowned river valleys, abandoned shorelines, submerged forests, stone structures, roads, harbours, graves, tools, animal remains, and traces of human occupation from periods when sea level stood far lower than it does today. These places do not confirm Plato's account, but they change the atmosphere of the search. They show that entire human worlds have genuinely disappeared beneath water, sometimes so completely that later generations forgot they had ever existed. The largest of these lost landscapes were created by the end of the last ice age. At the height of glaciation, enormous ice sheets held enough water to lower global sea level by more than 100 meters. Continents extended farther outward. Islands were joined to larger land masses. Wide plains occupied areas that now continental shelf. Rivers crossed terrain where fishing boats now pass overhead. As the climate warmed, the ice melted and the sea advanced. The process unfolded over thousands of years, but it did not feel slow everywhere. Low plains could flood rapidly once rising water crossed a threshold. Storms, surges, earthquakes, and local collapses added sudden violence to a long-term transformation. Doggerland is one of the clearest examples. It once connected Britain with continental Europe across what is now the southern North Sea. Rather than a narrow bridge, it was a broad inhabited region of rivers, wetlands, woodlands, grasslands, lakes, and low hills. Human groups moved through it, hunted there, gathered plants, fished its waterways, and followed animals across terrain that later vanished beneath the sea. For much of modern history, Doggerland existed only as a possibility inferred from geology and occasional finds dragged from the seabed. Fishing vessels recovered bones, antlers, stone tools, and fragments of peat. Offshore surveys conducted for energy projects began mapping buried river systems and ancient surfaces beneath marine sediment. The North Sea slowly revealed itself as a drowned landscape rather than a timeless body of water. Recent research using sedimentary ancient DNA has added extraordinary detail. Genetic traces preserved in buried sediments indicate that parts of Doggerland supported forests earlier than researchers once expected. The environmental record includes evidence of animals such as deer, wild boar, bears, and aurochs. These were not empty flats exposed briefly between ice and ocean. Some regions offered habitats capable of supporting both wildlife and human communities. The final disappearance was uneven. Rising seas fragmented the landscape, turning high ground into islands and forcing people toward shrinking shorelines. One late surviving region may have remained around what is now Dogger Bank, a massive submarine landslide off Norway, known as the Strega Slide, generated a tsunami around the early 6th millennium BCE. Waves struck coasts around the North Sea and may have devastated surviving lowlands. Scholars still debate how fully the event contributed to Doggerland's final abandonment. but it offers a real example of long-term inundation punctuated by sudden catastrophe. Doggerland is sometimes called Britain's Atlantis, yet the phrase is metaphorical. It was not a single circular city, a metal-rich empire, or an island ruled by descendants of Poseidon. Its significance is deeper. It demonstrates that inhabited territories large enough to shape migration and memory can disappear beneath the sea until only scattered evidence remains. For people living through the loss, the shoreline would not have been a fixed edge. It would have been a moving force consuming familiar ground. Far to the southeast, another drowned world once joined Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania within the larger landmass known as Sahul. During periods of lower sea level, vast plains extended across what are now the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and parts of the continental shelf. Human communities entered Sahul tens of thousands of years ago and adapted to environments ranging from tropical forests to open grasslands and dry interiors. As the Ice Age ended, rising seas divided this larger continent. New Guinea separated from Australia. Tasmania became an island. Coastal plains, freshwater systems, and migration routes disappeared underwater. Researchers reconstruct these lost landscapes using bathymetric maps, climate models, sediment records, and archaeological evidence from the surviving land margins. Some studies describe the submerged regions of Sahul as an Australian Atlantis, again using the term as a vivid analogy rather than a literal identification. The vanished terrain may have supported substantial populations over long periods. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, and resource-rich coastal zones would have attracted settlement and movement. When water advanced, communities did not simply watch an empty plain disappear. They lost hunting grounds, pathways, camps, sacred places, and familiar relationships between land and sea. Oral traditions among indigenous Australian communities include accounts of coastlines, islands, and places now beneath the water. Researchers have explored whether some stories may preserve memories of post-glacial sea level rise across remarkable spans of time. Such interpretations require caution because oral traditions are complex, adaptive, and embedded in living cultures rather than preserved as geological reports. Yet they raise an important possibility. Memories of drowned landscapes may survive far longer than written history, though transformed by ritual, language, and meaning. The Mediterranean itself contains more direct urban examples. Off the coast of Laconia in southern Greece lies Pavlopetri, a submerged settlement whose streets and building foundations can still be traced beneath shallow water. The site includes houses, courtyards, tombs, and pathways preserved across the seabed. Occupation extended through parts of the Bronze Age, and the settlement appears to have participated in maritime networks linking the Greek mainland with the wider Aegean. Pavlopetri did not vanish as dramatically as Plato's Atlantis. Its submergence may have resulted from a combination of earthquakes, local land movement, and gradual sea level change. The water covering it is shallow enough that the plain of the town remains visible. Archaeologists can survey walls, recover pottery, and reconstruct the shape of streets. It offers a rare view of what a real drowned settlement looks like: incomplete, eroded, partly buried, and firmly connected to known material cultures. Its reality makes it more valuable than any uncertain sonar circle. Pavlopetri has datable artifacts, architecture, graves, and a clear archaeological context. It does not need to be larger than evidence allows. Its story is one of coastal vulnerability, trade, habitation, and eventual abandonment. UNESCO and heritage organizations have emphasized the need to protect it from anchors, pollution, looting, and damage. Even after surviving underwater for millennia, a lost city remains vulnerable to the modern world. Other submerged sites are less visually dramatic but equally important. In the Bay of Aarhus in Denmark, archaeologists have investigated a Stone Age settlement now lying beneath the sea. This site dates to roughly 8,500 years ago, when communities lived near shorelines that later moved inland as post-glacial waters rose. Underwater excavation has recovered traces of occupation from sediments protected beneath the bay. These discoveries show how much early human history may remain offshore. Coastal environments were attractive because they provided fish, shellfish, birds, plants, fresh water, transport routes, and access to multiple ecosystems. Yet the shorelines occupied during much of prehistory are now submerged. Archaeology conducted only on modern land therefore studies an incomplete world. Some of the most densely used landscapes may lie beyond today's beaches. Underwater archaeology is difficult. Visibility can be poor. Currents move sediment. Organic material decays unless buried in protective conditions. Stone walls may be scattered by waves. Wooden structures disappear. Sites are covered by sand, mud, or marine growth. Dating can be complicated when objects are displaced from their original positions. Researchers use sonar, magnetometers, sub-bottom profiling, diving surveys, remotely operated vehicles, and sediment coring. But each method reveals only part of the buried terrain. This difficulty explains both the promise and danger of Atlantis claims. Real submerged settlements can remain hidden for thousands of years. New technologies genuinely can reveal landscapes previously unknown. But underwater ambiguity also makes overinterpretation easy. A ridge can resemble a wall. A reef can resemble a road. A natural basin can resemble a harbour. Without artifacts, stratigraphy, construction evidence, and reliable dating, shape alone proves little. Doggerland, Sahul, Pavlopetri, and the drowned settlements of northern Europe belong to different periods and cultures. Yet together they reshape the question. The sea has erased human landscapes on a scale large enough to inspire legends. It has divided continents, buried towns, broken migration routes, and transformed valleys into seabeds. There are many real Atlantises in this broad sense, places once known, used, and remembered, then covered by water. But none reproduces Plato's island. The real archaeology is quieter and more fragmented. It reveals no single universal empire, only many communities adapting to unstable coasts. Their disappearance does not require a continent to sink in one night. It requires only rising water, moving ground, and enough time for memory to thin. The deeper underwater archaeology goes, the stranger the human past becomes. Not because one lost supercivilization waits beneath every sea, but because modern coastlines conceal how much of human history unfolded somewhere else. Atlantis remains unproven, yet the world beneath the waves is already filled with vanished countries of a different kind. The drowned landscapes make Atlantis more imaginable, but they also sharpen the problem. Once real submerged settlements are placed beside Plato's account, the differences become harder to ignore. Archaeology shows how coasts disappear, how towns are damaged, and how entire regions are lost beneath rising water. Yet it also shows what vanished societies leave behind. Pottery spreads beyond city walls. Tools move along trade routes. Mines scar hillsides. Food remains accumulate in refuse pits. Burial customs travel with populations. Languages leave echoes in names and inscriptions. Even when a capital is destroyed, An empire rarely vanishes without distributing evidence across the territories it once controlled. Plato's Atlantis is described as a power operating on an enormous scale. Its influence extends beyond its home island and into the Mediterranean. Its ships, armies, rulers, and resources connect distant regions. If such a system had existed in the 10th millennium BCE, it would represent not a missing city but an entire missing stage of human development. The archaeological record would need to contain metalworking, organized fleets, large agricultural surpluses, monumental construction, specialized labor, and extensive political control thousands of years before these features are otherwise known to have appeared together. That chronological contradiction is not a small gap that one remarkable discovery could easily close. Archaeology continually pushes the origins of technologies and complex behavior deeper into the past, but it does so through gradual patterns. Early villages become larger, food production intensifies, craft specialization grows, trade networks expand, social hierarchies become visible. Writing and state administration emerge much later in certain regions. Atlantis, taken literally, would require nearly all of these developments to appear at once, and then disappear so completely that later societies show no clear inheritance from them. The metal problem is especially severe. Plato's island is rich in gold, copper, tin, and orichalcum. Its walls are faced with metals, its temples are richly decorated, and its military forces belong to a world of chariots and organized warfare. Around 9600 BCE, however, the societies of the Mediterranean and Atlantic regions were not producing metals on anything like this scale. Native copper may occasionally have been collected and shaped in some parts of the world, but systematic mining, smelting, alloying, and large-scale bronze production came thousands of years later. A metal-rich empire would leave durable traces. Slag from smelting survives. Mining galleries remain in rock. Chemical pollution can become trapped in lake sediments and peat. Metal objects travel far from their source through exchange, conquest, and recycling. Even if Atlantis itself disappeared underwater, the territories it ruled and traded with should contain some evidence of its materials and techniques. None has been securely identified. Its ships create a similar difficulty. Maritime travel is ancient. Humans crossed open water long before written history, reaching islands and continents that required planning, navigation, and seaworthy vessels. Early seafaring should not be underestimated simply because boats made of wood, reeds, or hide rarely survive. Yet there is a major difference between occasional crossings or regional voyages and the maintenance of an imperial navy capable of transporting troops, goods, and officials across a vast domain. Large fleets required timber supplies, shipyards, skilled labor, rope production, sail-making, harbour facilities, repair systems, stored food, political organisation, and reliable routes. They also create contact. Foreign objects appear in ports. Artistic styles spread. Genetic relationships change. Stories of merchants and enemies circulate. An Atlantean thalassocracy reaching into Italy, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean would be expected to leave a pattern visible beyond the island itself. The absence of such a pattern is often explained by catastrophe, but catastrophe cannot erase every external consequence. If Atlantis conquered other peoples, those peoples would not all have been located on the sinking island. If it established colonies, some would survive elsewhere. If its ships traded widely, imported objects should remain in foreign settlements. If its armies campaigned across continents, weapons, fortifications, graves, and cultural disruptions should appear along the route. The disaster may explain why the capital is gone. It does not explain why the wider empire is archaeologically silent. Geography refuses to fit just as neatly. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles and says it lies before other islands, from which travellers could reach a further continent enclosing the ocean. This language has been interpreted in many ways. Some read it as an imagined Atlantic geography. Others argue that beyond could refer to a location near the mouth of the Mediterranean rather than far into the ocean. The ancient understanding of continents and seas differed sharply from modern mapping, making exact reconstruction uncertain. Still, most candidates require selective reading. Thera fits volcanic catastrophe but lies east of Gibraltar. Risha offers circles but lies inland. Doñana provides a western marshland but not a giant island. The Canaries are Atlantic and volcanic but lack the described civilization. Doggerland was large and inhabited but lies far north and disappeared through gradual inundation. Every proposal solves one part of the geography by weakening another. The scale of the island creates another contradiction. Plato says Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Ancient Libya generally referred to known North Africa, while Asia often meant the western part of Anatolia and lands farther east, depending on context. The phrase may not describe continents in the modern sense, but it still implies an enormous territory. No island of that size disappeared into the Atlantic during human history. Modern plate tectonics makes the old image of a sunken Atlantic continent especially difficult. Continental crust is thick and buoyant. It can be stretched, broken, flooded, and partly submerged over immense geological periods, but it does not normally plunge intact into deep ocean within a day. The Atlantic basin has been mapped through sonar, seismic surveys, drilling, gravity measurements, and satellite observation. There is no hidden continent matching Plato's island beneath the central ocean. Some researchers therefore reduce Atlantis from a continent-sized landmass to a smaller island surrounded by a wider territorial empire. Others reinterpret Plato's phrase as referring to political power rather than physical size. This makes the geography more plausible, but it changes the plain meaning of the description. As with the chronology, every correction creates a version of Atlantis that fits modern evidence by becoming less like Plato's Atlantis. The concentric capital seems precise, yet it also resists identification. Natural landscapes frequently produce circle and arcs, volcanic calderas, eroded domes, impact structures, salt formations, reefs, river bends, and sediment patterns can all appear ringed from above. Human settlements can also be circular, but Plato's city combines multiple navigable water rings, bridges, walls, harbours, temples, docks, and a canal leading to the sea. No proposed site has securely revealed this entire system with artifacts and dates matching the account. Measurement deepens the problem. Converted into modern distances, Plato's central plain becomes immense, while the surrounding ditch appears almost beyond practical construction. The volume of earth that would need to be removed is staggering. A canal system on that scale would require labour, tools, administration, and maintenance comparable to the greatest engineering states of later antiquity. Yet the chronology places it before large-scale agriculture in much of the region. The account also combines features from different cultural and technological worlds. Chariots belong to the Bronze Age and later. Large trireme-like naval forces suggest historical Greek warfare. Monumental temples covered in precious materials evoke societies familiar to Plato. The political division among 10 kings resembles mythic genealogy. The sacred law, bull sacrifice, and divine ancestry fit Greek literary traditions. Atlantis may feel ancient, but many of its details appear constructed from elements known in Plato's own cultural environment. This does not prove that no historical memories lie beneath the story. A real Western kingdom, an Aegean eruption, a drowned coastal settlement, Egyptian ideas about deep time, and Greek fears of imperial power could all have contributed fragments. But fragments are not the same as a hidden geographical report. The account may be a composite whose parts come from different centuries and places. The missing evidence, therefore, becomes a central clue rather than an empty space. Atlantis is not absent because underwater archaeology has searched every metre of ocean and found nothing. Much of the seabed remains poorly explored, and new submerged sites will certainly be discovered. But the civilization Plato describes should have left evidence far beyond one undiscovered location. Its absence across the wider archaeological record is difficult to explain. No single contradiction destroys the story by itself. Ancient measurements can be uncertain, dates can be symbolic, coastlines can change, records can vanish, oral traditions can transform. Yet when geography, chronology, technology, scale, navigation, and material culture all require separate corrections, the cumulative problem becomes substantial. The island can be made to fit almost any candidate only by changing enough of the account. The clues refuse to align because they may never have belonged to one historical place. Atlantis behaves like a mosaic assembled from moral philosophy, inherited myths, real disasters, political anxieties, and geographical imagination. Each piece may carry something true, while the full image remains literary. The puzzle deepens not because the evidence is leading toward a hidden empire, but because it keeps revealing how many different worlds Plato may have compressed into one doomed island. If Atlantis is a mosaic, the next question is whether Plato expected his audience to search for the original pieces. Modern readers often assume that every named place in an ancient text must correspond to a recoverable location. But Greek philosophy did not always work that way. Stories could be invented, adapted, or placed in remote time to test ideas that ordinary argument could not hold as vividly. A city could be imaginary and still reveal something true about power. A catastrophe could be literary and still draw its force from real earthquakes, floods, and political collapse. Atlantis may therefore be most useful not when treated as a map, but when treated as an experiment. One major scholarly interpretation sees the account primarily as political philosophy. Plato places it beside discussions of the ideal state, civic order, education, hierarchy, and the responsibilities of rulers. Ancient Athens represents discipline, moderation, and collective duty. Atlantis represents wealth, expansion, and the gradual loss of restraint. The contrast is not subtle. One society is materially limited but morally organized. The other possesses nearly every advantage and still becomes unstable because its rulers begin valuing power more than order. Under this reading, the island is less a lost country than a warning about empire. Its canals, fleets, metals, and royal ceremonies demonstrate the height of human achievement, but they also conceal the beginning of corruption. The Atlanteans do not become dangerous because their technology is too advanced. They become dangerous because prosperity alters their judgment. Divine inheritance is diluted by mortal appetite. The rulers still appear magnificent, yet their inner balance has changed. Zeus recognizes what ordinary observers cannot. This interpretation would have carried particular weight in Plato's world. Classical Greece had experienced war, imperial rivalry, political instability, oligarchic coups, democratic excesses, and the destruction of cities, Athens itself had built an empire through the Delian League, demanded tribute, punished rebellion, and eventually suffered defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Plato didn't need a prehistoric superpower to understand how confidence becomes overreach. Atlantis could magnify familiar political behavior until its pattern became impossible to miss. Some scholars have therefore read the island as a distorted mirror of imperial Athens. The connection is not exact. Plato's ancient Athens is idealized, while Atlantis performs the aggressive role associated with powerful states. Yet the inversion may be intentional. By giving the virtuous city the name of Athens and assigning imperial ambition to a distant enemy, Plato allows his audience to examine its own history at a safer distance. The warning becomes both flattering and accusatory. Athens once possessed the virtues required to resist empire, but the historical city known to Plato had not always resisted the temptation to become one. Others see Persian power behind the image. The Persian invasions of Greece offered a celebrated example of smaller Greek communities resisting a vast monarchy with enormous resources. Atlantis, like Persia in Greek memory, gathers many territories beneath royal authority and advances toward the Mediterranean world. Ancient Athens leads resistance against overwhelming strength. The similarity is suggestive, though Atlantis is not simply Persia renamed. Plato combines imperial structures, mythic genealogy, Greek ritual, and imagined geography into something more universal. The story may also echo the political form of Syracuse, Carthage, or other maritime powers familiar to the 4th century Mediterranean. Plato had personal experience with the court of Syracuse and with failed attempts to shape rulers through philosophy. A wealthy island state, naval ambition, dynastic politics, and the moral weakness of kings would not have been abstract themes for him. Atlantis may contain reflections from several contemporary powers without representing any one of them directly. Another interpretation places greater emphasis on cosmic and moral order. Timaeus is concerned with the structure of the universe, the relationship between reason and necessity, and the creation of an ordered world. Critias attempts to place human societies within that larger framework. Atlantis begins in harmony because divine and mortal elements remain balanced. Its political order reflects a sacred origin. When that balance decays, punishment follows. The catastrophe is therefore not random geology. It is the visible consequence of disorder. Yet the destruction of ancient Athens complicates this moral reading. The virtuous defenders also disappear in earthquakes and floods. Nature does not preserve them as a reward. This may suggest that the physical world remains governed by forces indifferent to human merit. Even when moral judgment operates within the story, political virtue determines how Athens responds to danger, not whether its citizens survive forever. A different scholarly approach treats Atlantis as a philosophical myth modelled on earlier Greek storytelling. Plato frequently uses myths at moments when rational argument reaches its limits. His myths are not necessarily childish fables or claims of literal revelation. They are structured narratives designed to make moral, political, or metaphysical relationships visible. Atlantis fits this method. It creates two societies, places them in conflict, and allows disaster to expose the consequences of their internal order. Calling the story a myth does not mean it has no relationship to history. Myths can absorb remembered events. The Trojan War tradition may preserve distant traces of Bronze Age conflict while transforming them through centuries of poetry. Flood stories can reflect local disasters while acquiring religious meaning. legends of vanished islands may grow from earthquakes, tsunamis, erosion, or shifting coastlines. Plato could have drawn from this reservoir while still composing Atlantis for his own purposes. This leads to the middle position Atlantis as a blend of invention and transformed memory. Under this view, there may be no single historical Atlantis, but the story may preserve echoes of several realities. The eruption of Thera contributes the image of an island catastrophe. Minoan Crete contributes maritime wealth and palace culture. Persian and Athenian imperialism contribute political structure. Egyptian antiquity contributes deep time and archival authority. Hellenic contributes the recent memory of a city overwhelmed by earthquake and water. Post-glacial flooding contributes the larger human awareness that land can vanish beneath the sea. The strength of this interpretation is that it explains why the account contains so many plausible elements without matching any one site. The weakness is that it can become too flexible. Almost any disaster, kingdom, or landscape can be declared a partial inspiration. Without evidence linking a specific source to Plato, the reconstruction remains inferential. What survives in the record suggests possible ingredients, but not a recoverable recipe. Some researchers continue to defend a more historical reading. They argue that Plato repeatedly insists the story is true and contrasts it with fabricated myth. The named chain through Solon and Egypt appears too elaborate, they say, to be dismissed casually. Precise measurements and geographical details may preserve a genuine tradition distorted by copying or translation. From this perspective, the task is to identify which features are accurate and which were altered over time. That argument deserves consideration because ancient authors did sometimes preserve real information inside accounts, modern readers once treated as fantasy. Archaeology has repeatedly confirmed that legendary places, forgotten kingdoms, and destroyed cities could have historical foundations. Troy is the most famous example, though the excavated site does not confirm every event in Homer. The discovery of a real place can coexist with a largely literary story. Yet Atlantis differs from Troy in one important respect. Troy belonged to a broad tradition visible across Greek epic and mythology. Atlantis appears almost entirely through Plato. No independent pre-Platonic account securely establishes the island, its war, or its royal genealogy. Later authors usually respond to Plato rather than preserve separate memories. The story's authority remains tied to the very text whose historical accuracy is under examination. There is also the possibility that Plato intended a deliberate fiction presented with the texture of history. Detailed framing, name transmitters, measurements, and solemn claims of truth can make an invented narrative more persuasive. Philosophical stories often work best when they feel as though they might have happened. The audience is invited to imagine consequences rather than verify coordinates. The unfinished ending leaves every interpretation slightly unstable. Had Critias continued, Zeus might have explained the moral purpose directly. The war may have been described in more detail. Atlantis may have been condemned in language clarifying whether it represented a specific political target. Instead, the text stops before judgment, preserving ambiguity. No single explanation fully accounts for the story's endurance. As pure allegory, Atlantis seems almost excessively geographical. As literal history, it conflicts too sharply with archaeology and geology. As transformed memory, it offers many plausible sources but no secure chain connecting them. The island survives between categories because Plato may have intended it to occupy more than one at once. Atlantis can be invented and still contain history. It can be morally symbolic and still reflect real fears. It can resemble Thera without being Thera, evoke Persia without being Persia, and mirror Athens without naming Athens as the object of criticism. The deeper scrutiny goes, the less useful the choice between fact and fiction becomes. The more revealing question is how Plato used the possibility of a lost world to make his own world visible. Once Atlantis leaves Plato's dialogues, it begins changing almost immediately. Later readers do not simply preserve the island as he described it. They enlarge it, relocate it, moralize it, spiritualize it, racialize it, mechanize it, and eventually turn it into one of the most adaptable lost worlds in human culture. Every age discovers different Atlantis because every age brings a different fear, ambition, or fantasy to the search. In antiquity, the first question was already familiar. Had Plato recorded history, or had he invented a philosophical tale? Some readers accepted the possibility that the island had existed. Others treated the story as one of Plato's crafted myths. Ancient geographers and historians knew that the Western Ocean contained islands, but none produced independent evidence of the empire described in Timaeus and Critias. The story remained attached to Plato, even when writers discussed it as though it might refer to a real place. This dependence matters. Atlantis did not enter later culture through multiple surviving traditions converging on the same lost civilization. It entered through two texts, one brief and one unfinished. Almost everything added afterward came from interpretation rather than new evidence. The gaps in Plato's account became opportunities. Because Zeus never delivers his speech, later writers could imagine the final judgment. Because the island's location remains broad, maps could place it almost anywhere. Because its technology is impressive but recognizably ancient, later ages could upgrade it according to their own idea of advancement. During the medieval period, Atlantis did not dominate European thought in the way it later would. Plato's works circulated unevenly in the Latin West, and interest in ancient geography was shaped heavily by biblical history, classical authorities available in translation, and inherited cosmological models. The island never vanished completely, but it waited at the edge of intellectual culture until renewed access to Greek texts allowed Renaissance scholars to revisit Plato more directly. The European voyages across the Atlantic transformed the story. Once lands unknown to classical geography entered European maps, Atlantis became available as an explanation for the newly encountered world. Some writers propose that the Americas were the remains of Plato's island or the territories beyond it. Others used Atlantis to imagine ancient contact between continents. The discovery, conquest, and classification of distant peoples produced urgent questions about human origins, migration, biblical chronology, and the relationship between old world and new. Atlantis became a bridge across those uncertainties. This was not a harmless expansion of myth. European authors sometimes used the island to fit indigenous civilizations into histories centered on Europe or the Mediterranean. Monumental architecture in the Americas was occasionally attributed to refugees from Atlantis rather than to the societies that built it. Such theories reduced the achievements of living and ancestral peoples by assigning their knowledge to a vanished external source. The lost island became a convenient ancestor whenever actual history seemed too unfamiliar. The Renaissance and early modern imagination also turned Atlantis into a model society. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, published in the 17th century, did not claim to reveal Plato's location. It used the name to create a fictional island devoted to organized knowledge, experimentation, and social improvement. Atlantis had become more than a warning about corruption. It could now represent an ideal future disguised as a hidden ancient place. The 19th century altered the story more dramatically. Industrialization, imperial expansion, new geological discoveries, evolutionary theory, and rapidly developing archaeology reshaped European ideas about deep time. Ancient civilizations were being excavated and deciphered. Troy, Nineveh, and long-forgotten kingdoms moved from legend into material history. In this atmosphere, Atlantis no longer seemed impossible merely because it lacked proof. Perhaps, enthusiasts argued, it awaited its own archaeologist. One of the most influential modern versions appeared in Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882. Donnelly argued that Atlantis had been a real mid-Atlantic civilization and the source from which many later cultures inherited agriculture, religion, architecture, mythology, and technology. Similarities between distant societies were presented as evidence of diffusion from a single lost center. The book was widely read and enormously influential, but its method reflected the limitations and prejudices of its time. Superficial resemblances were treated as proof of common origin. Chronology was stretched. Independent invention was underestimated. Archaeological evidence was selectively assembled. Complex civilizations across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas were reduced to descendants of one vanished culture. Donnelly's Atlantis also gave the legend a continental scale familiar to modern audiences. Maps showed a large landmass occupying the central Atlantic, connecting the old and new worlds before sinking in catastrophe. Geology later made such a recent vanished continent increasingly implausible, but the image proved durable. It offered a simple explanation for cultural similarities, migration, flood myths, and unexplained ruins. More importantly, it gave readers a prehistoric civilization advanced enough to stand above ordinary history. Occult movements added another layer. Theosophical writers placed Atlantis within vast cycles of human spiritual and biological development. Its inhabitants became root races, psychic adepts, or possessors of powers beyond modern science. The island was divided into epochs, migrations, and subraces described with elaborate confidence but unsupported by archaeology. Crystals, energy systems, telepathy, and esoteric knowledge entered the legend through these later traditions, not through Plato. Some occult versions also absorbed racial hierarchies common in 19th and early 20th century thought. Atlantis was used to construct imagined ancestries for supposedly superior peoples. These ideas later overlapped with nationalist and extremist attempts to locate the origin of favored populations in a heroic prehistoric civilization. The island became politically dangerous when myth was presented as racial history. Stories of secret archives, recovered tablets, and inherited Atlantean documents multiplied. One especially persistent tale involved Paul Schliemann, who claimed familial access to evidence supposedly discovered by his grandfather Heinrich Schliemann, the excavator associated with Troy. Reports described artifacts and sealed instructions linking ancient cultures to Atlantis. The documentation did not withstand scrutiny, yet the association with a famous archaeological name gave the claims an appearance of legitimacy. This pattern became central to modern Atlantis culture. A dramatic document appears. A map is said to contain hidden knowledge. An artifact is reported from a private collection. A deceased relative supposedly left instructions that cannot be independently verified. The claim gains attention because it promises direct proof, but the material itself remains unavailable, ambiguous, or demonstrably fabricated. Scholars examining the reception of Atlantis have repeatedly encountered suspicious texts whose authority depends more on atmosphere than provenance. The 20th century then delivered Atlantis to mass entertainment. Novels, comics, films, radio, television, and later video games freed the island from every historical constraint. Atlantis could be a crystal-powered metropolis beneath the Atlantic, a surviving underwater kingdom, an alien colony, a source of magic, or a technological civilization destroyed by its own weapons. These versions often preserve only a few Platonic elements: the island, its wealth, its pride, and its fall. Popular culture made the image visually stable even while the evidence remained unstable. Concentric canals became gleaming rings, towers rose from blue water, submarines passed through drowned streets, statues stood beneath schools of fish. The modern Atlantis is now so familiar that Plato's quieter political framework can seem like a secondary interpretation rather than the source. The rise of documentary television and internet media created yet another Atlantis. Satellite images, sonar scans, digital terrain models, and computer reconstructions gave old speculation a technological surface. A circular formation discovered from space could be placed beside Plato's measurements within hours. An underwater anomaly could be rendered as walls before divers examined it. Maps, animations, and dramatic narration made uncertain evidence feel nearly complete. Social media accelerates this process. A claim no longer needs years to circulate. One aerial image of Richat, one sonar pattern near Cádiz, or one newly mapped seamount can generate thousands of confident identifications. Corrections travel more slowly because geological explanations are less emotionally satisfying than the announcement of a lost civilization. Yet each reinvention reveals something about the people making it. Renaissance writers used Atlantis to understand newly encountered continents. Victorian theorists used it to unify human civilization beneath one origin. Occultists used it to imagine hidden spiritual knowledge. Nationalists used it to manufacture ancestry. Science fiction used it to explore technological pride. Modern media uses it to convert uncertainty into discovery. Atlantis escaped Plato because it was never confined by evidence strong enough to fix its meaning. The island remains spacious enough to hold whatever later cultures place upon it. What began as a philosophical civilization beyond the pillars became an ancestral homeland, a utopia, a racial myth, an occult archive, a sunken machine city, and a recurring headline. The original island vanished once. Its later versions have been sinking and resurfacing ever since. The modern search for Atlantis rarely begins with a ruined city uncovered stone by stone. More often, it begins with an image. A sonar scan shows parallel ridges. A satellite photograph reveals circles in a desert. A diver records blocks beneath shallow water. An old map appears to depict a coastline before it was supposedly known. A seamount is discovered beneath the Atlantic. Each fragment arrives with the same possibility attached to it. Perhaps this is the evidence that finally moves Atlantis from philosophy into history. The difficulty is that images persuade faster than evidence accumulates. A geometric shape feels intentional. A straight line looks like a wall. A circle resembles Plato's rings. Once the comparison is made, the human eye begins completing the pattern. Broken ridges become streets. Natural terraces become docks. Shadows become entrances. The imagined city appears before archaeology has established that human hands shaped anything at all. Sonar is especially vulnerable to this transformation. Side-scan sonar sends sound toward the seabed and records the strength of the returning echoes. Hard rock, soft sediment, steep slopes, debris, reefs, and artificial structures produce different patterns. The resulting image can resemble an aerial photograph, but it is not one. It is a visual interpretation of reflected sound. Regular-looking forms may be created by geology, erosion, sand waves, fishing activity, pipelines, shipwreck material, or errors in processing. Resolution matters. So does the angle of the sonar beam. A single pass can exaggerate edges that appear very different when surveyed from another direction. For that reason, unusual sonar features are only the beginning of an investigation. A credible archaeological claim requires repeated surveys, accurate coordinates, direct inspection, samples, and a clear geological context. Divers or remotely operated vehicles must determine whether a suspected wall consists of fitted masonry or fractured bedrock. Sediment cores can reveal when a surface was exposed. Pottery, tools, organic material, or construction debris may provide dates. The results must then be described in enough detail for other specialists to assess them. Claims near Cádiz illustrate the gap between announcement and confirmation. Sonar and remote sensing images have been presented as evidence for submerged structures outside the Strait of Gibraltar. The setting is attractive because it lies beyond the Pillars of Heracles and near a coast repeatedly affected by earthquakes, tsunamis, and changing shorelines. Some images have been described as walls, circular works, or harbour installations resembling Plato's capital. The interpretation remains disputed. Without independently verified excavation, securely dated artifacts, and proof that the formations are artificial, the scans cannot establish the existence of Atlantis. They may reveal something archaeologically important. They may also represent geological structures or remains from a much later historical period. The phrase Atlantis found enters public circulation before the more difficult question has been answered. What exactly has been found? LIDAR can create a similar illusion of certainty. By measuring reflected laser pulses, it can reveal subtle differences in elevation beneath vegetation and expose roads, platforms, walls, field systems, and buried channels. It has transformed archaeology in forested regions and broad landscapes. Yet LIDAR does not identify a civilization by itself. A circular elevation may be ancient, natural, agricultural, or modern. Interpretation still depends on excavation and dating. Satellite imagery has produced some of the most viral candidates. The Richat Structure is the clearest example. Its concentric rings are so visually striking that comparison with Atlantis feels almost unavoidable. From orbit, the formation resembles the plan of a monumental circular city. When the surrounding Sahara is imagined as a greener landscape, dry channels become former waterways and gaps in the rings become possible harbour passages. Geological fieldwork, however, explains the structure through uplift and erosion. Different layers of rock weather at different rates, producing the circular ridges. Magmatic activity beneath the region contributed to the dome's formation, but the rings themselves are not constructed walls. The scientific explanation does not make Richat less extraordinary. It places its history in the Cretaceous and later geological processes, rather than in a vanished human empire. Maps create a different category of claim. The Piri race map, drawn in the early 16th century, is often invoked as evidence that an advanced ancient civilization possessed knowledge of coastlines supposedly unknown to its maker. Some interpretations claim that its southern landmass represents Antarctica before ice covered it, perhaps mapped by Atlantean navigators. Historians of cartography generally find less mysterious explanations. The map was assembled from earlier nautical charts, geographic traditions, reports from recent voyages, and the conventions of its period. Its distorted coastlines reflect the difficulties of combining sources drawn at different scales. The southern landmass can be understood within older traditions of imagining a great continent balancing the lands of the north. It does not provide a securely identifiable ice-free Antarctic coastline, much less evidence of an Atlantean survey. Ancient inscriptions are equally attractive because writing appears capable of naming what geology cannot. From time to time, symbols on stones, tablets, or artifacts are claimed to preserve the language of Atlantis or record migration from the lost island. Yet inscriptions require provenance. Archaeologists need to know where an object was found, within which layer, beside what other material, and under what conditions. An isolated object appearing in a private collection without excavation records carries little evidential weight. The history of Atlantis research contains numerous dubious documents. Some are obvious modern inventions. Others combine authentic antiquities with false translations or unsupported stories about their origin. A text may be genuine while the claimed reference to Atlantis exists only in interpretation. Repeated geometric marks become a map. A common royal title becomes the name of an Atlantean king. Similar-looking symbols from distant cultures are treated as one alphabet without demonstrating linguistic relationships. The same caution applies to monumental stone formations beneath water. At sites such as Yonaguni in Japan, broad terraces and sharp edges have inspired claims of artificial architecture. Some geologists argue that natural fracturing and erosion can produce much of the observed geometry, while others believe parts may have been modified by people. Even if human activity were demonstrated, that would not connect the site to Atlantis. A structure can be ancient, unusual, and genuinely disputed without becoming evidence for Plato's island. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas follows the same pattern. Large stone blocks form a roughly linear feature in shallow water. Supporters describe it as a harbour wall or road belonging to a lost civilization. Geological studies identify the stones as beach rock, fractured into blocks and displaced by natural coastal processes. Human use or modification has occasionally been proposed, but no convincing evidence ties the formation to an advanced prehistoric Atlantic culture. New geological discoveries are especially easy to misrepresent. When researchers mapped Los Atlantes near the Canary Islands, the name and the imagery of drowned volcanic summits invited immediate connection to the legend. The discovery was real. Some of the volcanic structures may once have risen above sea level, yet their emergence and submergence occurred tens of millions of years before human beings. Geological evidence for a vanished island is not archaeological evidence for a vanished civilization. This distinction often disappears in headlines. Island that sank beneath the Atlantic becomes possible origin of Atlantis. Circular structure detected offshore becomes ruins match Plato. Ancient settlement found underwater becomes real. Atlantis discovered. The wording moves through stages of certainty that the evidence itself has not crossed. Researchers studying genuine submerged archaeology usually speak more carefully. They describe anomalies, probable structures, cultural layers, preliminary dates, and competing interpretations. Certainty grows slowly because underwater sites are difficult to investigate and easy to disturb. The public announcement often reverses this process. It begins with certainty and allows caution to appear later, usually after the dramatic story has travelled far beyond the correction. There is also a financial and cultural incentive to identify Atlantis. Books, exhibitions, documentaries, expeditions, tourism, and online audiences all benefit from the name. A submerged Bronze Age settlement may receive modest attention under its own identity and international coverage when described as a candidate for the Lost Island. This does not mean every researcher acts dishonestly, but it creates pressure toward comparison long before proof exists. A convincing discovery would need far more than circles, walls, or a Western location. It would require a securely dated settlement whose architecture, environment, political scale, and material culture correspond meaningfully with Plato's description. Evidence would need to survive independent review. The wider region would have to reveal trade, settlement, or imperial connections consistent with the proposed civilization. Extraordinary claims do not demand impossible perfection, but they do demand a coherent pattern. So far, the pattern has not appeared. There are real underwater towns, real volcanic collapses, real tsunami deposits, real seamounts, real ancient maps, and real unexplained structures. Each may teach something important about the past. None has yet established Atlantis as a historical empire. The announcements continue because the search is built around a story capable of absorbing almost any anomaly. Every circle resembles the capital. Every drowned shore resembles the catastrophe. Every western ruin resembles the empire. Yet scrutiny repeatedly separates the dramatic image from the slower evidence beneath it. The more powerful the claim, the more ordinary the work required to test it becomes survey, excavation, dating, comparison, and patience. After every proposed island, every sonar image, every volcanic crater, every drowned plain, and every ancient text, the central mystery remains almost exactly where Plato left it. No excavation has revealed the capital of Atlantis. No inscription names its kings. No fleet, colony, mine, or conquered province has been securely identified. No geological event matches the scale, location, chronology, and suddenness of the destruction as a single historical catastrophe. The search has uncovered extraordinary things, but the island itself continues to recede. This does not mean the investigation has failed. It means the most important discovery may be that Atlantis is not one puzzle, but several puzzles folded together. Plato's texts ask how political societies decline. The chronology asks how ancient people imagined deep time. Thera asks how volcanic disaster becomes cultural memory. Doggerland and Sahul ask how much human history lies beneath post-glacial seas. Pavlopetri and submerged Stone Age settlements ask how coastlines erase ordinary lives. Richat and Los Atlantes ask how geological forms acquire human meaning. Modern announcements ask why uncertainty is so easily converted into proof. The layers do not lead toward one conclusion because they may never have begun in one place. The story may contain memories of earthquakes, floods, naval powers, ruined islands, and eroded landscapes without preserving a literal report of one civilization. Plato may have gathered recognizable fragments precisely because they made his invention credible. A fully imaginary island becomes more persuasive when its harbours resemble real ports, its rituals resemble known religious customs, its political decline resembles historical empires, and its destruction resembles catastrophes the audience already fears. If this is what happened, searching for the single location of Atlantis may be like searching for the one city that inspired every city in a dream. One street comes from memory, another from rumour, another from fear. The resulting place feels real because its elements are real. Yet the whole exists only in the act of combination. Scholars still debate how much inherited material Plato may have used, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the composite nature of the account explains why candidates repeatedly appear convincing in part and impossible in total. Thera possesses the maritime prosperity and volcanic catastrophe, but not the Atlantic location or immense scale. Southern Iberia possesses the western setting and tsunami history, but not the required empire. Richat possesses the rings, but they are geological and far from the sea. The Canary region possesses drowned volcanic islands, but their submergence predates humanity by millions of years. Doggerland possesses an enormous lost landscape, but not a city of metals and chariots. Pavlopetri possesses genuine streets beneath the sea, but its archaeology belongs to a known Bronze Age community. Each candidate resembles one face of the story because Plato's island contains many faces. It is a city, an empire, a sacred landscape, a moral failure, a geological catastrophe, a forgotten war, and a challenge to the limits of historical memory. A place able to satisfy every detail may not exist because the details were never drawn from a single map. The strongest conclusion is therefore also the least sensational. Atlantis has not been demonstrated as a historical civilization matching Plato's description. This statement does not depend on assuming that ancient people were incapable of seafaring, engineering, or complex social organization. They were capable of all three, often earlier and in more sophisticated forms than previous generations of scholars imagined. The problem is not that Atlantis seems too impressive for ancient humanity. The problem is that the specific civilization Plato describes appears nowhere in the material record at the time and scale he assigns to it. A future discovery could alter part of this picture. Underwater archaeology is still young compared with excavation on land. Large areas of continental shelf remain poorly surveyed. New settlements, harbours, shipwrecks, and drowned landscapes will certainly be found. Some may reveal levels of organisation or maritime activity not currently expected. Archaeology has overturned confident assumptions before, and it will do so again. Yet an unknown settlement is not automatically Atlantis. A genuine discovery would need to be understood within its own evidence before it was placed inside Plato's narrative. Its age, architecture, economy, environment, cultural connections, and manner of destruction would all need independent examination. The greater the similarity claimed, the stronger the complete pattern would have to be. One circular feature or one dramatic flood deposit could not carry the burden alone. The continuing absence of such a pattern has not weakened popular interest. In some ways, it has strengthened it. A confirmed archaeological site eventually becomes bounded by facts. Its streets are measured, its pottery is classified, its dates narrow, its population estimates become cautious. Mystery gives way to specific questions. Atlantis remains free because it has never been fixed in this way. It can still be the lost origin of civilization, a drowned Bronze Age kingdom, an Ice Age empire, an allegory of power, or a warning about environmental collapse. Its uncertainty is not merely an obstacle to the legend. It is the condition that allows the legend to survive. There is also something deeply modern in the desire to find it. Contemporary societies possess technologies capable of mapping the seabed, scanning beneath soil, dating organic material, and reconstructing ancient climates. The world feels as though it should no longer contain blank spaces. A lost civilization seems like a final challenge to a planet increasingly measured from orbit. Atlantis promises that one enormous secret may still remain beneath the water, waiting for an image clear enough to transform myth into history. But the real discoveries are often stranger than the expected one. Sedimentary DNA rebuilds forests where the North Sea now moves. Stone Age tools emerge from drowned coastlines. Streets remain beneath shallow Greek waters. Volcanic mountains rise from the Atlantic floor. Remnants of islands erased before humanity existed. ancient shorelines reveal that people once crossed and inhabited territories absent from every modern map. None of these worlds is Plato's empire, yet together they show that disappearance is not mythical. Perhaps this is why the puzzle deepens instead of closing. The search begins with one island and ends with a planet of vanished landscapes. It begins with a city lost in one terrible day, and ends with coastlines transformed across thousands of years. It begins with the hope of finding a single advanced civilization, and ends with evidence for countless communities whose lives unfolded near shores that no longer exist. Those communities left no grand philosophical warning. Most were not empires. Their settlements contained hearths, tools, food remains, tracks, graves, and the ordinary structures of survival. The sea covered them without preserving their names. Their loss reminds us that absence in the record does not always mean absence in the past, but it also reminds us that evidence, when recovered, has its own shape. It does not become whatever story later ages wish it to be. Plato's island should therefore remain under scrutiny rather than under dismissal or belief. As literature, it is one of the most powerful accounts of political excess ever written. As a possible container of historical memory, it deserves careful comparison with real disasters and ancient societies. As archaeology, however, it remains unconfirmed. The responsible position is not to declare that every feature was invented with certainty, nor to announce that one favoured site has solved the mystery. It is to hold the distinction between possibility and proof. That distinction is less dramatic than a sunken palace rising from sonar shadows, but it leads to a richer past. It allows Thera to remain an extraordinary volcanic civilization rather than an imperfect Atlantis. It allows Doggerland to become a lost Mesolithic country in its own right. It allows Rishi to preserve a geological history measured in millions of years. It allows Pavlopetri and the submerged settlements of Denmark to speak through their own artifacts rather than being forced into Plato's rings. Atlantis survives. Then, not as a solved location but as a meeting point between several human instincts, the need to remember disaster, the fear that wealth cannot prevent collapse, the suspicion that history has forgotten more than it preserves, and the hope that something magnificent still waits beneath the surface. The island is most powerful where certainty fails. It stands just beyond the border of evidence, visible enough to pursue and distant enough to remain whole. And now the search begins to quiet. The ships leave the imagined harbour one by one. The metal-covered walls dim beneath an evening sky that never belonged to any confirmed geography. Beyond them, the Atlantic stretches outward, not as an empty blue field, but as a layered archive of reefs, ridges, sediments, drowned valleys, and shorelines once crossed by human feet. Somewhere beneath those waters lie settlements that have not yet been mapped. Their inhabitants did not know that their homes would one day become seabed, or that distant people might search the ocean for a different lost world. Time rarely preserves the stories people consider most important. It keeps a cooking vessel and loses the name of its owner. It leaves a stone foundation while removing the roof, the voices, and the reason a doorway faced the sea. It buries forests beneath mud, lifts harbours above water, and turns roads into channels for fish. Civilizations imagine themselves as permanent because their walls feel solid within a human lifetime. The earth measures solidity differently. Perhaps no island ever sank exactly as Plato described. Perhaps echoes of several catastrophes reached him through stories already altered by centuries. Perhaps the entire landscape arose within philosophy, built to show that power without restraint eventually turns against itself. the final certainty remains unavailable, and that may be the most honest ending. Far below the moving surface, real lost places rest in darkness. Above them, waves erase the boundary between history and imagination again and again. The rings of Atlantis remain unbroken only in the mind, where no earthquake can scatter them and no excavation can reduce them to ordinary stone. The island is still out there in the older sense, not necessarily as land, but as a possibility carried forward by memory. Beyond the last known shore, beyond the final line on the map, it waits in the quiet space where human stories go when the evidence has faded, and where the sea keeps everything it has taken.